Chapter 1: The Unsealing. The air in the sub-basement of the old Northgate Asylum hung thick and damp, a tapestry woven from decades of neglect and the persistent odor of decay. Marcus, Mac Cole shone his industrial flashlight along a surprisingly solid brick wall where blueprints suggested a forgotten access corridor. Dust motes danced in the beam, a silent ballet in the oppressive stillness. "This is it," Max stated, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. He tapped the brickwork with a gloved knuckle, solid as the day they laid it, whatever day that was. Beside him, young Davy, the newest addition to Mac's demolition and renovation crew, shivered despite the cloying humidity. "Creepy down here, boss. You sure this ain't just a structural wall?" Mac grunted, a sound of mild impatience. He was a man built of practical angles and hard-won experience, not given to flights of fancy. Plans say sealed wing access. Old plans granted, pre-1920s according to the city archive. This whole section was supposedly condemned, bricked up after some sort of incident. He didn't elaborate on the incident. The city records were vague, unsettlingly so, speaking of quarantine and public health concerns without specifics. It was a detail that pricked at the edges of his usually unflappable demeanor. Two other crew members, Sal and Javi, approached, carrying pry bars and a heavy-duty sledgehammer. "Ready when you are, Mac," Sal announced, his breath misting slightly in the cooler air near the wall. Mac nodded. "All right, let's start with a pilot hole. Javi, go easy. We don't know what's on the other side or how stable this section is." Javi, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his arms, positioned the tip of a long steel chisel against a mortar line. He hefted the sledgehammer, the polished steel catching the flashlight beams. The first impact was a dull thud, absorbed by the ancient brick. The second, a sharper crack, dust puffed. With a series of precise, powerful blows, Javi worked along the mortar, Mac directing him with curt gestures. An hour later, a section of bricks, roughly 3 feet square, had been loosened. Mac motioned for Javi to stop. "Pry bars. Let's see if we can pull this section clean." Working together, Sal and Mac wedged their bars into the gaps. With a synchronized heave, punctuated by groans of protesting mortar and the screech of brick against brick, the section gave way. It tumbled inwards with a heavy, resonant boom, followed by a cascade of crumbling debris. A wave of air, impossibly cold and carrying a scent Mac couldn't immediately place, something like dry paper, metallic rust, and a faint, almost sterile sharpness washed over them. Davy coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. "Whoa, smells like a tomb." Mac ignored him, directing his flashlight beam into the newly created aperture. Darkness. Absolute, unyielding darkness. "All right, let's widen it. Davy, go fetch Dr. Reed. She wanted to be here for the initial breach." Davy, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the sub-basement, scrambled off. Dr. Evelyn Reed arrived a few minutes later, a compact woman with intelligent, keen eyes that missed nothing. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, her usual academic composure tinged with an almost palpable excitement. She was a medical historian, and the prospect of an untouched, century-old asylum wing was akin to an archaeologist finding a pharaoh's tomb. "Mr. Cole," she greeted, her voice crisp, "you've made progress." "Doctor," Mac acknowledged, just about to open her up properly. "Air on the other side is old." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the dark opening. "Fascinating. Any initial readings? Air quality contaminants?" "Haven't gotten that far," Mac replied, gesturing for Sal and Javi to resume their work. "Just the smell test. It's different." The crew worked with renewed vigor, the opening widening steadily. Soon, it was large enough for a person to step through, though the floor on the other side was obscured by shadow and a lip of fallen brick. Mac took a powerful, wide-beam lantern from his kit. He switched it on, its bright white light cutting into the gloom. The beam revealed a corridor stretching away into blackness. The walls were stone, coated in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Cobwebs so dense they looked like funerary shrouds, hung in great festoons from the ceiling and draped over unseen objects along the walls. A few paces in, a heavy wooden door, its paint cracked and peeling, hung crookedly on one hinge. Further down, another doorway and another. "Incredible," Evelyn breathed, stepping forward, her earlier excitement now mixed with a visible awe. "It's as if time stopped in here." "Maybe it did," Sal muttered, peering over her shoulder. Mac took a deep breath. The unusual scent was stronger now. Not foul, not like typical decay, but profoundly still. "All right. Safety masks on, everyone. We don't know what spores or bacteria have been breeding in here for the last 100 years." He donned his own respirator, the rubber hissing as it sealed around his face. Evelyn did likewise, her eyes, the only part of her face visible, glinting with anticipation. "I'll go first," Mac declared, clipping the lantern to his belt. He checked the charge on his radio. "Comms check. Sal, you got me." Sal's voice, tinny through the radio, confirmed. "Loud and clear, Mac." "I'm heading in about 20 feet. Visual inspection. Then we decide how to proceed with documentation and safety sweeps before any actual work starts. Dr. Reed, you stay here with Sal until I give the all clear." Evelyn nodded, though a flicker of impatience crossed her eyes. Mac gripped his heavy flashlight firmly. He stepped onto the rubble, then carefully, deliberately into the forgotten wing of Northgate Asylum. The silence that enveloped him was profound, a physical weight. The dust on the floor was inches thick in places, muffling his footsteps almost completely. His light carved a path through the oppressive darkness, revealing more of the corridor. Doors, all closed, lined both sides. Some had small, barred windows, too high to see through easily. He paused, listening. Nothing. Not the scuttling of rats, not the drip of water. Just absolute, unbreathing silence. The cold was more pronounced here, a damp chill that seeped into his bones despite his work clothes. He raised his radio. "Mac to Sal, I'm in. Corridor stretches maybe 60, 70 feet, then appears to turn right. Multiple rooms, dust is incredible, like a snowdrift. No immediate structural concerns visible from here. The air is still very cold." "Copy that, Mac," Sal's voice crackled back. "Anything else?" Mac swept his light around. Something glinted low on the wall near one of the doors, a small metallic plaque. He moved closer, brushing away a century of grime with a gloved finger. Words etched into the metal became faintly visible. He leaned in. Ward C. Observation extended stay. Observation, he murmured, the word tasting strange in the dead air. He ran his light along the door itself. It was heavy oak, banded with iron. A small, sliding panel, a Judas window, was set into it at eye level. It was closed. A faint prickling sensation traced its way up his spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was an awareness, a primal sense of occupancy. He shook his head. Imagination. The place was a crypt. "All right, Evelyn," he said into the radio. "You can come in, but stick close and watch your step." He turned to wait for her, his flashlight beam cutting a swathe through the ancient, silent darkness. The wing seemed to hold its breath around him. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Dust. Evelyn Reed moved with a careful, almost reverent tread, her masked face angled to take in every detail as she stepped from the relative familiarity of the sub-basement into the time capsule of Ward C. The sudden drop in temperature was noticeable, as was the peculiar stillness of the air, which seemed to press in from all sides, heavy and expectant. "Extraordinary," she murmured, her voice muffled by the respirator. Her gaze swept from the dust-laden floor to the cobweb-choked ceiling. "Mr. Cole, the level of preservation is unprecedented. It's as if it were sealed yesterday, not a century ago." Mac grunted an affirmative. "Dust is thick enough to ski on. Careful where you put your feet. God knows what's under it." Sal followed Evelyn, Javi and Davy bringing up the rear, their boots crunching softly on the fallen mortar near the entrance. They too were visibly affected by the atmosphere, their usual worksite banter subdued to hushed observations. "Look at these doors," Sal said, running a gloved hand near but not touching one of the heavy wooden barriers. "Solid oak. They weren't messing around." Evelyn approached the door Mac had examined, the one marked Ward C Observation Extended Stay. Extended stay observation, she mused. That could mean a number of things in the parlance of early 20th century asylum care, typically for patients considered particularly difficult or those undergoing specific long-term treatments. Her voice carried a clinical detachment, yet her eyes, visible above her mask, held a spark of fervent academic curiosity. "Any idea what kind of treatments, Doc?" Javi asked, his voice a little too loud in the profound quiet. Evelyn turned slightly. "It varied wildly. Hydrotherapy, electrotherapy in its nascent stages, prolonged isolation, experimental medications. The period this wing was likely sealed, say between the 1910s and early 1920s, was a strange transitional time for psychiatric care. A lot of theories, not a lot of oversight." A faint draft, impossibly cold, snaked its way down the corridor from the unexplored depths, causing the ancient cobwebs to sway like ghostly veils. Davy rubbed his arms. "Feels colder the further in you look." Max swept his primary beam down the corridor. "It does seem to drop off. We'll need to get some environmental sensors in here. Temperature, humidity, air particulates." He looked at Evelyn. "You said there were no specific records for a Ward C in the main asylum archives." Evelyn shook her head, her brow furrowed. That's what's so peculiar. Northgate's records, while old, are generally comprehensive for the period. There are mentions of a West Wing isolation unit in some older anecdotal accounts, staff memoirs, things like that. But nothing official, no patient registers, no architectural plans that match this exact layout. It's as if this section was deliberately expunged. Or just forgotten, Sal offered, though he didn't sound convinced. To be forgotten this completely, within an institution that continued to operate for another 50 years on this very site, Evelyn countered gently. Possible, but improbable for an entire wing. Mac decided to press on. All right, let's move a little further in. Single file, watch for trip hazards. Don't touch anything unless absolutely necessary. This is a historical site now, Dr. Reed. Potentially a very significant one, Mr. Cole, she affirmed. They proceeded slowly, their lights cutting through the gloom. The corridor was perhaps 8 feet wide. Every 10 feet or so, another heavy door presented itself, identical to the first. Each bore a small, tarnished brass number plaque, but no other designation. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gritty dust and their own muffled breathing. Evelyn paused by one door numbered C3. She tilted her head. Do you hear that? Max stopped, holding up a hand for silence. They all listened intently. A faint sound, barely perceptible. It was a soft, dry scratching, almost like fingernails on wood, or perhaps rats, though Mac hadn't seen any droppings or other signs of vermin, which was odd in itself for such an old, abandoned space. Rats, maybe, Davy whispered, his eyes wide. Could be settling, Mac said, though the sound had a certain rhythmic quality that didn't quite fit with the random creaks and groans of an old building. It seemed to be coming from within room C3. He shone his light on the Judas window. It was closed tight. Anyone got a Slim Jim or a probe? I don't want to force these doors unless we have to. Sal shook his head. Nothing that wouldn't damage it. Evelyn was examining the edges of the small sliding panel. This one seems cleaner, less corroded than one might expect. She carefully gripped the tiny metal tab with her gloved fingers and pulled. With a dry screech that echoed unnaturally in the corridor, the small panel slid sideways, revealing a square of profound blackness beyond. A collective intake of breath. Evelyn leaned forward, trying to peer inside, her flashlight beam aimed through the opening. The scratching stopped. The air that puffed out from the small window was icy, far colder than the corridor, and carried that same distinct, unidentifiable sterile sharpness, now more potent. Evelyn recoiled slightly. There's something obstructing the view, and the smell is much stronger from in there. Mac moved her gently aside and took a look. The interior of the cell was dark, but his powerful beam picked out shapes. A simple iron bed frame, rusted and bare. A small, overturned stool. And the walls, they were covered in something. Scratches. Thousands upon thousands of them gouged deep into the plaster, forming chaotic patterns, almost like a desperate, unreadable script. Sweet mother, Sal breathed, looking over Mac's shoulder. Looks like your rats were busy, Davy, Javi said, but his attempt at humor fell flat. The scratching sound. It hadn't been rats. Evelyn was now looking at the floor just outside room C3. She knelt, pointing her own light at a faint disturbance in the thick dust. "Mr. Cole, look at this." Mac joined her. There in the otherwise pristine layer of dust were faint, almost imperceptible drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled out of or into the room. But they were ancient, covered by a thinner, more recent veil of dust, implying they were made long ago, yet after the initial thick layer had settled. And more disturbingly, they led from the door, a short distance into the corridor, and then just stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. "What do you make of that?" Mac asked, his voice low. Evelyn traced the edge of one mark with a gloved finger, careful not to disturb it further. I don't know. It's not consistent with simple debris movement. It looks deliberate." A sudden, sharp metallic clang reverberated from further down the corridor, making them all jump. It was followed by a series of lighter, skittering sounds. "What was that?" Davy yelped, spinning around. Mac raised his hand for quiet, his head cocked. "Came from down near the turn. Sal, Javi, stay with the doctor. Davy, you're with me. Let's check it out. Radio's on, people." He and Davy moved cautiously down the corridor, their flashlight beams stabbing ahead. The silence had returned, now somehow more menacing after the sudden noise. The peculiar cold intensified with every step. The air felt charged like before a thunderstorm. As they neared the bend in the corridor, Mac noticed something on the wall to his left. It was at eye level, on a relatively clear patch of stone between two doors. A single, perfectly circular mark in the dust. It was about the size of a human fist, darker than the surrounding dust, as if the dust had been compressed or absorbed. It looked wet, though it wasn't. And in the center of it, almost like a pupil, was a small, darker still, almost black pinprick. Max stopped, staring at it. "What in the hell?" Davy, looking past him, gasped, "Boss, the end of the hall." Mac tore his gaze from the strange mark and looked. The corridor turned sharply right. But just before the turn, something was on the floor, something metallic. It was an old, rusted tin cup, the kind he'd seen in photos of Victorian prisons. It lay on its side, as if recently dropped. The clang. He took another step, his light fixed on the cup, and then he saw them. Footprints. Small, bare footprints in the dust, leading away from the cup and around the corner. They were distinct, yet faded, as if made by something not quite solid, pressing lightly into the ancient dust. And there were far too many toes, or so it appeared in the wavering light. "Stay here, Davy," Mac ordered, his voice tight. He didn't like this, not one bit. This wasn't just an old, forgotten wing. He approached the corner slowly. The sterile, metallic scent was very strong here. He held his breath, listening. A soft sound from around the bend, like sighing or whispering, too faint to make out words if they were words at all. He took a deep breath, gripped his flashlight like a club, and peered around the corner. The corridor continued for another 30 feet, ending in a solid brick wall, clearly the original outer extent of this wing. More closed doors. And nothing else. No source for the footprints, no one there. The whispering, if he'd even heard it, was gone. But on the far wall, directly opposite him, another one of those circular marks stared back from the dusty brickwork. This one was larger, the size of a dinner plate. And in its center, a dark, unblinking spot that seemed to drink the light from his flashlight. It looked for all the world like a gigantic, unblinking eye, watching him from the century-old dust. Chapter 3: Cold Spots and Cold Cases. Max stared at the unsettling mark on the far wall. The eye seemed to possess a depth that defied the flat surface of the brick. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, the distinct feeling of being scrutinized not by a person but by the environment itself. He raised his radio, his voice a low growl. "Sal, you and Javi bring Dr. Reed up, slowly. There's something here you all need to see." He kept his light trained on the mark. It didn't change, didn't waver, yet the impression of a focused gaze was overwhelming. Davy joined him at the corner, his face pale above his respirator. "Boss, what is that thing?" Davy whispered, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as he, too, focused on the mark. "I don't know," Mac admitted, "but I don't like it." He took a step into the new section of corridor, his boots crunching softly. The cold here was intense, a biting chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Definitely a significant temperature drop in this area. Evelyn, Sal, and Javi arrived a minute later, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly when she saw the mark on the far wall. "Remarkable," she breathed, stepping forward slowly, her gaze analytical. "It's almost like a focal point." "A focal point for what?" Sal asked, his usual bravado tempered. "And what about those footprints Mac mentioned, the ones with too many toes?" Mac gestured to the dusty floor near the corner. "They were right here, leading this way, there. Fainter now." He frowned. The prints he had seen so clearly moments before were now barely discernible, as if the dust itself was settling back, erasing them. Evelyn knelt, her own light scanning the area. "There are definitely disturbances, subtle indentations, but the clarity you described, it's fading rapidly." She looked up at the large circular mark. "This, however, is quite distinct. It doesn't appear to be a stain or any kind of biological growth I recognize. It's as if the dust itself has been altered." Javi, ever the pragmatist, ran a gloved hand along a section of untouched wall nearby. "Dust is thick everywhere, but that spot—" He peered at the eye. "It's like it's fresher or cleaner but wrong." "The tin cup that made the noise is gone too," Max stated, sweeping his light around the floor where it had lain. "Vanished." An uneasy silence settled over the group. The only sounds were their muffled breaths and the distant, almost subliminal hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the asylum. "Okay," Max said, breaking the quiet. "This wing is officially weirder than advertised. Dr. Reed, any theories on these marks?" Evelyn stood, brushing dust from her knees. "Not without proper analysis. They could be caused by localized moisture condensation, a chemical reaction in the dust from something in the bricks, or something else." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken something else hanging heavy in the frigid air. She walked closer to the large mark, her head tilted. "The symmetry is what's most striking, And this central point. She reached out a tentative finger towards the dark center, then hesitated. It almost looks like an aperture. An eye, you mean? Davy supplied, still visibly unnerved. Evelyn didn't dismiss it. The human brain is programmed to see faces, patterns. But yes, the resemblance is notable. She turned away from it. We need to document this meticulously. High-resolution photographs, dust samples from the mark and control samples from adjacent areas, temperature readings across the entire wing, particularly focusing on these cold spots. Mac nodded. Sal, Javi, head back to the truck. Get the environmental survey kit, extra lanterns, and the high-res camera. And bring a couple of those heavy-duty barricade lamps. I want this whole corridor lit up like a Christmas tree. Davy, you stay with us. Radio if you see or hear anything, anything at all. As Sal and Javi retreated down the corridor, their footsteps echoing strangely, Mac turned back to Evelyn. So, no records, strange smells, vanishing cups, disappearing footprints, and wall art that watches you. Anything else we should expect from a West Wing isolation unit that got itself bricked up? Evelyn was examining one of the cell doors in this colder section. This one was numbered C12. Unlike the others, its Judas window was missing entirely, leaving a jagged, dark hole. Given the extreme measures taken to seal this place, Mr. Cole, I would expect the unexpected. Institutions like Northgate in that era didn't simply wall off entire sections without profound cause. Publicly, they might have cited plague or structural instability. Privately, the reasons could have been far more complex. Meaning, Mac pressed. Meaning patients who were not just ill, but perhaps perceived as dangerous in ways that conventional methods couldn't manage, or incidents the administration wanted buried so deeply they'd never see the light of day. She ran a gloved finger along the edge of the broken Judas window. The damage here looks old but violent. A low groan echoed from within C12, followed by a soft, rhythmic thumping. Mac and Evelyn froze. Davy, who had been nervously scanning the corridor behind them, whipped around. What was that? Mac held up a hand for silence. The thumping continued, steady and deliberate. Bump, bump, bump. It sounded like something soft but heavy repeatedly hitting the inside of the door. He approached C12 cautiously, Evelyn a step behind him. He angled his flashlight towards the jagged opening of the Judas window, trying to peer inside. Darkness. The thumping stopped. Anything, Evelyn whispered. Can't see much. Interior is too dark from this angle, Mac replied, his voice low. He leaned closer, straining his eyes. Wait a second. A faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of light from deep within the cell. Not a reflection, but a source. Two tiny pinpricks, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence like animal eyes in the dark. But these were too steady, too aware. They seemed to be looking directly at him through the hole. Then a soft, wet sigh issued from the opening, carrying that now disturbingly familiar sterile metallic scent, laced this time with something else, something vaguely organic and unpleasant. Mac pulled back abruptly. There's something in there or someone. Davy took an involuntary step back. In there, after 100 years, no way, boss. I saw eyes, Mac stated flatly. and I heard breathing. Evelyn looked at him, then at the door, her expression unreadable. The official story was that this wing was evacuated before sealing. Official stories have a habit of leaving out the messy parts, Mac countered. He thought of the scratching sounds from C3, the footprints, the watching eye on the wall. A grim pattern was beginning to form in his mind, one he didn't like at all. Sal and Javi returned, laden with equipment. The corridor brightened considerably as they set up the powerful barricade lamps, their steady orange glow pushing back some of the oppressive shadows, though the corners and the interiors of the cells remained stubbornly dark. "Got the gear, Mac," Sal announced. "What'd we miss?" "Company, possibly," Mac said grimly, gesturing to C12. "Dr. Reed, any old Asylum records ever mention patients being left behind?" Evelyn was already unpacking a digital thermometer with a probe. It would be anathema to any stated medical ethics even then, but in a situation deemed extreme, under severe duress or a cover-up, one cannot entirely rule out undocumented actions. She began taking temperature readings. The ambient here is 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Remarkable. Back by the entrance it was closer to 58. She moved towards C12. "Let's see what it is near this door." As she approached C12, the probe nearing the jagged Judas window, the thumping started again, louder this time, more frantic. Bump, bump, bump. And with it, a low guttural sound like someone trying to clear a throat thick with phlegm or perhaps a growl. The temperature probe in Evelyn's hand suddenly plummeted. 38.35, 30 degrees, she exclaimed, pulling her hand back as if scalded. "The air coming from that opening is incredibly cold." The thumping became a violent banging. The heavy oak door shuddered in its iron frame. Dust rained down from above it. "Okay, that's enough of that," Max said firmly. "Whatever's in there is strong, and it doesn't like us." He looked at the door, then at his crew. "No one opens any of these doors until we know a hell of a lot more about what we're dealing with. Sal, Javi, let's get those cameras set up. Motion-activated night vision. I want eyes on this whole section, especially C3 and C12. And that mark at the end of the hall." As the crew got to work setting up the surveillance equipment, Evelyn moved back to the large eye mark on the far wall. She carefully collected dust samples, her brow furrowed in concentration. The biting cold in that section of the corridor seemed to cling to her, and Mac noticed her periodically rubbing her arms, despite her professional focus. He found himself glancing repeatedly at the mark. It still felt like it was watching him, watching all of them, and he had the distinct, unsettling impression that it was learning. Chapter 4: The Historian's Unease. Days bled into a week. The initial eerie thrill of discovery for the renovation crew had curdled into a persistent, gnawing unease. Mac Cole enforced a strict buddy system for anyone entering Ward C, and work was confined to daylight hours, though daylight never truly penetrated the wing's oppressive, windowless depths. The barricade lamps cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar tools and equipment into monstrous shapes. Productivity, Mac noted with grim resignation, had plummeted. His men were jumpy, prone to snapping at each other, their laughter infrequent and strained. The strange eye marks persisted. More appeared smaller ones like unsettling freckles on the ancient stone, always in places that offered a strategic view of the crew's activities. They resisted all attempts at cleaning. Scrubbing only seemed to smear them, making them angrier, more defined for a short while before they returned to their original state. Samples taken by Evelyn yielded nothing conclusive, just dust, incredibly fine, with trace elements common to old brick and mortar, yet somehow altered at a microscopic level she couldn't yet define. The cold spots remained, shifting occasionally, making certain sections of the corridor unbearable for more than a few minutes. Evelyn Reed, however, seemed to thrive in the oppressive atmosphere, or perhaps it was more accurate to say she was consumed by it. She had set up a makeshift office in a less frigid alcove near the entrance to Ward C, surrounded by her laptop, stacks of printed historical documents, and sample bags. The institutional Northgate Asylum records, which she had initially found frustratingly devoid of information about Ward C, had begun to yield whispers when cross-referenced with more obscure sources. Journals of former staff purchased from antique dealers, century-old local newspaper articles detailing vague disturbances at the asylum, even transcripts from a largely discredited spiritualist society that had attempted to investigate Northgate in the 1930s. Mac found her there one afternoon, hunched over a faded, leather-bound ledger, a magnifying glass in her hand. Her usual neat bun was slightly askew, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even her professional demeanor couldn't quite conceal. "Burning the midnight oil, doctor?" Mac asked, keeping his voice even. He'd made it a habit to check on her. Her intensity was starting to worry him. Evelyn looked up, her eyes taking a moment to focus on him, as if surfacing from a deep dive. "Oh, Mr. Cole, yes, you could say that. The information is fragmented, like piecing together a shattered mirror, but patterns are emerging." "Anything I should be worried about?" Mac leaned against the grimy wall. The air here still carried that faint, sterile, metallic tang, a constant reminder of the wing's unique and unsettling nature. She tapped the ledger with a gloved finger. "This is a private journal, belonged to a Dr. Alastair Finch. He was a junior physician here at Northgate from 1908 to 1915. His official notes are bland, uninformative, but this," she sighed, a sound of weary frustration. He was terrified of this place. Specifically, a section he refers to only as the lower annex or sometimes Ward Somnus. "Ward Somnus," Mac repeated, "sleep ward or the opposite?" "The opposite, I suspect," Evelyn said grimly. "Finch speaks of patients who didn't respond to conventional treatments, patients exhibiting extreme, unremitting agitation, insomnia so profound it led to complete psychological disintegration. He mentions experimental protocols, things that were never documented in the official asylum logs." "Like what?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping back to the spidery handwriting in the journal. "He's often oblique, uses classical allusions, as if afraid to write things plainly even in his own diary. But he mentions the chair of unceasing current and the bath of frozen stars. Prolonged hydrotherapy in ice water, certainly, and some form of electroshock, but cruder, more sustained than what became common practice later." Her voice was low, tinged with a mixture of academic fascination and revulsion. And these were used in this wing. Mac gestured vaguely towards the dark corridor beyond. The timeline fits with when this wing was likely active and subsequently sealed, Evelyn confirmed. Finch describes the lower annex as being buried deep, cut off from the light. He also mentions a specific patient. No name, never a name, just the sleepless one or patient zero vigil. A chill, unrelated to the ambient temperature of Ward C, traced its way down Mac's spine. He remembered the eyes he'd seen in C12, the profound sense of being watched by the eye marks. The sleepless one, he echoed. What happened to this patient? Evelyn turned a page, her brow furrowed. Finch's entries become increasingly erratic around 1914. He writes about a contagion of unrest, a miasma of waking dread emanating from the lower annex, staff refusing to work there, other patients in nearby wards becoming agitated, mimicking symptoms he speaks of a presence, a consciousness. She paused, looking directly at Mac. He believed the sleepless one's mind, through sheer, unending torment and wakefulness, was somehow imprinting itself on the environment, affecting others. Mac thought of his crew, their irritability, their shared unease, the oppressive feeling that permeated the wing. And what did they do about it, according to Finch? The entries stop abruptly in early 1915, Evelyn said, closing the ledger gently. His landlady, in a later note appended to the journal by a relative who inherited it, stated Dr. Finch suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was himself institutionalized, though not at Northgate. He died a few years later, never having recovered his speech. The silence that followed was heavy. Max straightened up. So, a doctor driven mad by whatever was happening here, and a patient whose mind could, what? Infect a place. It sounds like a Gothic novel, I know, Evelyn conceded, rubbing her temples. But the physical evidence we're encountering, the extreme cold spots, these persistent eye marks, the localized sounds with no discernible source, they defy conventional explanation. Finch's journal, however subjective, provides a potential, albeit terrifying, context. A context that suggests this wing isn't just old and creepy, but actively hostile, Mac finished. He pushed himself off the wall. We need to be more careful, Evelyn. My men are already on edge if this gets out. I understand, Evelyn assured him. I haven't shared the more speculative aspects of Finch's journal with anyone else, but the name, Ward Somnus, and the concept of a sleepless one, it resonates unpleasantly with what we are experiencing. She picked up a small evidence bag containing a sample of dust from one of the eye marks. I'm sending these for more advanced spectrographic analysis. Perhaps there's a unique chemical signature, something that might explain the localized environmental effects, even if it doesn't explain. She gestured vaguely towards the oppressive depths of the wing. Mac nodded. Keep me informed. Anything concrete I need to know. My priority is the safety of my crew. If this place is genuinely hazardous, beyond normal structural or environmental concerns. Of course, Mr. Cole, Evelyn replied, though her gaze was already drifting back to her notes. her mind clearly still grappling with the secrets of Ward C. As Mac walked back towards the main work area, where his crew was attempting to map the electrical conduits in the less disturbing section of the corridor, he couldn't shake the image of Dr. Finch, driven mad by the miasma of waking dread. He found himself looking at the eye marks with a new apprehension. Were they just strange formations of dust? Or were they, as Finch had posthumously suggested, the viewing ports of a tormented, sleepless consciousness, imprinted on the very stones of Northgate Asylum? He stopped by room C3, the one with the walls covered in scratches. The Judas window was still open a crack from their initial exploration. He hesitated, then leaned closer, shining his flashlight through the narrow opening. The chaotic scratches seemed to writhe in the moving light, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a new scratch, one that hadn't been there before, a perfect, deeply gouged circle, with a single dark point in its center. He pulled back sharply, his heart thudding. He told himself it was a trick of the light, the power of suggestion fueled by Evelyn's disturbing findings. But the metallic taste of unease was strong in his mouth. This wing wasn't just a job anymore. It was a puzzle with deeply unsettling implications, and he had a growing fear that some pieces were best left unfound. Chapter 5: Night Shift Jitters. The decision to post a night watchman in Ward C hadn't been Mac's. It came down from the project overseers, a pencil pusher named Henderson who'd never set foot in the asylum sub-basement. Standard procedure for a site with valuable historical artifacts and ongoing work, Cole, Henderson had stated over the phone, his voice smooth and oblivious. Insurance, you understand. Mac understood Henderson wanted to tick a box on a form. He argued against it, citing the wing's oppressive atmosphere and the unexplained phenomena, but Henderson had been unyielding. So, reluctantly, Mac had assigned the duty to an older, taciturn security guard named Al Hibbs, a veteran of countless lonely night shifts in deserted buildings. Hibbs was unflappable, or so Mac had thought. After Hibbs's third night, he found Mac as the day crew was clocking in, his usually impassive face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple lack of sleep. "Mr. Cole," Hibbs began, his voice raspy, "I need a word." They stepped into the grimy, makeshift break area just outside the sealed wing's entrance. Hibbs accepted a coffee from Mac, his hand trembling slightly as he took the steaming styrofoam cup. "Something happened, Al?" Mac asked, keeping his tone casual. Hibbs took a long sip of coffee, his gaze distant. "Place ain't right, Mr. Cole. That new wing you opened up. It ain't right at night." Mac waited. Hibbs wasn't prone to exaggeration. "First couple of nights just the usual old building stuff," Hibbs continued. "Creaks, groans, wind whistling where there ain't no windows. Expected that. But last night—" He paused, looking around as if to ensure they weren't overheard though they were alone. "The sounds changed." "It changed how?" "Got organized," Hibbs said, his eyes meeting Mac's. "Like, talking, whispering, couldn't make out words, mind you, too faint, like a radio tune just off station, coming from deep in that corridor, and the cold spots. They move, Mr. Cole, I swear they do. 1 minute the end of the hall near that big eye thing on the wall is like a meat locker. Next, it's the area by that cell you folks were looking at, the one with the broken peeper. Mac thought of C12, the thumping. Hibbs nodded slowly. Yeah, heard that too. Soft at first, like a heartbeat, then louder, like someone wanted out, but it wasn't just the thumping, it was a feeling like being stared at from all sides, even in the pitch dark when my flashlight was off. He took another gulp of coffee. And the shadows, Mr. Cole, they play tricks, or something in there does. What kind of tricks? Saw a man, I thought, Hibbs said, his voice dropping lower. Tall, real thin, standing way down the end of the hall by that weird eye mark. Just a shape darker than the dark. Blinked and he was gone. Told myself it was my eyes playing up. Tired, you know, but it happened twice. Mac felt a familiar chill. He thought of Dr. Finch's journal, the sleepless one, the contagion of unrest. He thought of the insomnia hounds they had yet to name, but whose presence he felt was an inevitability. You report this in your log, Al. Hibbs snorted. And say what? Saw a ghost, felt spooky vibes. They'd laugh me out of a job. No, I'm telling you because you seem like a man who listens. Something's wrong in there, Mr. Cole, real wrong. He looked down at his coffee cup. I ain't quitting, need the money, but I'm telling you that place. It ain't empty. Mac clapped a hand on the older man's shoulder. I appreciate you telling me, Al, directly. I know this site is unusual. We're taking precautions. He didn't elaborate on Evelyn's research or the increasingly unsettling evidence. No need to spook Hibbs further. Anything else? Hibbs hesitated. Yeah, one more thing. The cameras your boy Sammy set up. Samuel Sam Kwon was Mac's young, tech-savvy crew member, responsible for the surveillance equipment. What about them? One of them, the one pointed right at that big eye mark at the end of the main corridor, it went offline round 3 a.m. just. Static. The others are fine. But that one? Dead. Hibbs shook his head. Probably just a glitch. Old wiring maybe, but with everything else. I'll have Sam check it out, Mac said. Thanks, Al, get some rest. Hibbs nodded, relief flickering in his tired eyes. Will do, Mr. Cole. He trudged off, leaving Mac alone with his thoughts. A tall, thin man, whispers, moving cold spots, a dead camera. Later that morning, Mac found Sam Kwon in the small, cluttered area Evelyn had partially commandeered, hunched over his laptop, surrounded by cables and spare camera parts. Sam, Al Hibbs said camera 3 went down last night, Mac began. Sam looked up, pushing his glasses further up his nose. He was a whirlwind of nervous energy, perpetually fiddling with some piece of tech. Yeah, I saw that on the remote log when I came in. Power feed issue, I think, or maybe interference. That whole wing is an electronic nightmare. All that old metal in the walls, the density of the stone. Signal penetration is awful. Interference, Mac asked. What kind? Sam shrugged, tapping absently on his keyboard. Hard to say. Could be anything from degrading insulation on ancient electrical conduits to, well, to anything. I was going to go in and check the cabling. Maybe swap out the unit if it's fried. You logged the footage from the other cameras before it went down. Yeah, standard procedure, Sam affirmed, pulling up a series of video files. Mostly nothing, dust motes, cobwebs swaying, the usual creepy ambience. Hibbs doing his rounds. Wait, Sam paused a video feed, leaning closer to his screen. This was from camera 2, positioned midway down the corridor, looking towards the eye mark and the now-dead camera 3. "What is it?" Mac asked, stepping closer. The timestamp on the footage was 2:58 a.m., moments before camera 3 reportedly went offline. The image was grainy, illuminated by the eerie orange glow of the barricade lamps and the camera's own infrared. Al Hibbs was nowhere in sight, presumably at the other end of his patrol route. "Look there," Sam whispered, pointing to the far end of the corridor, near where camera 3 was mounted. "See that flicker?" Max squinted. A faint, almost subliminal distortion in the image, like heat haze, but somehow darker. It shimmered for a few seconds, then solidified just for a moment into something more defined. It was tall and thin, just as Hibbs had described. A shadowy silhouette, standing motionless, directly in front of camera 3. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid shape that seemed to absorb the already dim light. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it dissolved, the image flickering again before returning to normal, just an empty, silent corridor. A few seconds later, the feed from camera 3, visible in a small window on Sam's monitor, cut to static. Mac felt his stomach tighten. "Can you enhance that?" Sam was already clicking, zooming, adjusting contrast. "It's low light, heavily compressed, but there's definitely something there, boss. Not a shadow, not a reflection. It's an object or an entity. It blocks the light from the barricade lamp behind it." He looked up at Mac, his usual youthful exuberance completely gone, replaced by a wide-eyed apprehension. "What was that, Mac?" Mac stared at the frozen, enhanced image of the tall, thin silhouette. He thought of Somnus Nullus, the Sleepless one. He thought of Dr. Finch's descent into madness. "I don't know, Sam," Mac said, his voice grim. "But I think it's time we stopped calling them glitches." He straightened. "Get your gear. We're going in to check that camera, and this time we're taking a few extra precautions." The wing was no longer just passively unsettling. It was actively responding, and it was starting to show itself. Chapter 6: Erratic Frequencies. The atmosphere in Ward C felt different as Mac and Sam Kwon made their way towards the dead camera. It wasn't just the usual oppressive silence and biting cold. There was an added tension, a sense of alertness, as if their conversation about the shadowy figure had been overheard by the wing itself. Sam, usually chattering about tech specs or complaining about interference, was uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes darting nervously into every shadow doorway. Mac carried a heavy-duty lantern that threw a wide, bright cone of light, and a steel pry bar that felt reassuringly solid in his grip. Sam had his toolkit, a replacement camera, and a multimeter for checking electrical currents. They moved with deliberate steps, the crunch of their boots on the dusty floor sounding unnaturally loud. "See anything on the other monitors before we came in?" Mac asked, keeping his voice low. Sam shook his head. "All clear, just empty corridors. Hibbs is probably asleep in the main security office by now. Said he was having trouble, resting after his shift." Mac grunted. He could understand why. They reached the spot where camera 3 was mounted, high on the wall, angled towards the large eye mark at the corridor's end. The small lead on the camera unit, usually a reassuring green, was dark. "Okay, let's see what we've got," Max said, steadying the ladder Sam had brought. Sam climbed up, plugged his multimeter into the camera's power connector. He frowned. "Power feed is live, 120 volts steady, so it's not the wiring from the junction box, at least not this side of it." He unplugged the camera and began examining its casing. No obvious physical damage, no scorch marks. He turned it over in his hands. "These things are pretty robust, sealed units, weatherproofed even though it's indoors, for it to just die like that." "The figure we saw on the other camera feed," Max said, his gaze sweeping the corridor, especially the large eye mark which seemed to stare back with cold indifference. "It was standing right here when this unit went down." Sam paused, looking down at Mac. "You think it did something to the camera, like an EMP or something?" "I don't know enough about EMPs to say," Mac admitted, "but I think it's too much of a coincidence to ignore." He tapped the eye mark on the wall. "And I think this thing is related. Maybe it's the source of whatever interference you've been picking up." Sam finished removing the dead camera and carefully handed it down to Mac. "I'll take this back to the workshop, see if I can diagnose what fried it. Might tell us something." He took the new camera from his bag. "Let's get this one up and running. Same specs, but I've added an extra shielding layer to the casing on this one. Just a hunch." As Sam worked on installing the replacement camera, Mac took the opportunity to examine the large eye mark more closely. He ran his flashlight beam over its surface. The texture was still that of compressed dust, yet the central pupil seemed to possess an almost liquid depth, as if one could fall into it. The biting cold was most intense here, radiating from the wall in palpable waves. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms standing on end. "Anything, boss?" Sam asked from the ladder. "Just watching," Mac muttered. He had an almost irresistible urge to touch the center of the mark, but Dr. Finch's warnings about a contagion of unrest echoed in his mind. He kept his distance. Suddenly, Sam yelped, nearly dropping his screwdriver. "Whoa!" Max spun around. "What is it?" "Static shock," Sam exclaimed, shaking his hand. "A big one. Came right off the camera casing as I was tightening the bracket. Never had that happen before." "You grounded?" Mac asked. "Yeah, standard procedure. Rubber-soled boots, insulated tools for the electricals. That was weird, felt like a cattle prod." Sam cautiously reached for the camera again, then hesitated. His portable radio, clipped to his belt, crackled loudly with static, a burst of harsh white noise that made them both jump. It lasted for a few seconds, then died down, replaced by a faint, rhythmic pulsing sound. Thump thump, thump thump. Like a distant heartbeat, picked up by the radio's sensitive microphone. "What is that?" Sam whispered, his eyes wide. Mac recognized the sound. It was similar to the thumping they'd heard from inside cell C12, but this was clearer, more defined, as if the source was closer, or the radio was particularly attuned to its frequency. "It's coming through your radio. Is it on scan?" Sam fumbled with the device. "No, it's locked on our crew channel. There's no transmission." The thumping continued, steady and unsettling, broadcast into the dead air of Ward C. Then, another sound joined it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic thumps. It was a sound of profound suffering, yet also held an undercurrent of something else, something predatory. "That's not C-12, Max said, his gaze sweeping the corridor. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, amplified by the radio. "Switch it off, Sam." Sam fumbled with the radio's power button, his fingers clumsy. The device slipped from his grasp, hit the rungs of the ladder with a clatter and fell to the dusty floor. The battery compartment sprang open, batteries scattering. The sound stopped. Silence rushed back in, thick and heavy. "Damn it," Sam muttered, starting to climb down. "Leave it for now," Max said. "Let's just get that camera live and get out of this section." Sam, visibly shaken, quickly finished connecting the new camera. The small green LED blinked on, a tiny beacon of technology in the ancient, oppressive gloom. "It's online," he confirmed, his voice tight. "Signal looks strong. Shielding must be helping." "Good," Max said. "Let's pack up." As they were collecting their tools, Mac noticed something on the floor where Sam's radio had fallen. One of the AA batteries lay near the base of the wall, right beside a smaller, freshly formed eye mark that hadn't been there moments before. The battery was visibly dented, and a faint wisp of smoke curled from one end. It looked as if it had been subjected to intense, localized heat or electrical discharge. He picked it up carefully. It was still warm. He showed it to Sam. "Think that static shock you got was just static." Sam stared at the battery, then at the new eye mark, his face paling. "No way that thing on the wall, it's drawing power, or projecting it." "Or both," Max said grimly. He looked back at the large eye mark at the end of the corridor. It seemed to pulse faintly in his peripheral vision, a trick of the light perhaps, or perhaps not. "Okay," Max said, his voice decisive. "Evelyn needs to know about this. This isn't just a historical curiosity anymore, Sam. These things are interactive and potentially dangerous." They gathered their equipment, Mac pocketing the damaged battery. As they retreated from the deeper section of the wing, Mac couldn't shake the feeling that their every move was being monitored, analyzed, and that the wing was learning far more about them than they were about it. The silence that accompanied their departure felt less like emptiness and more like a coiled predator, patiently waiting. Back in the relative safety of the main entrance area, Sam immediately plugged his laptop into the new camera's feed. The image was clear, sharp. The corridor stretched away, bathed in the orange glow of the barricade lamps, ending in the large, starring eye mark. "Looks stable," Sam said, a hint of relief in his voice. "Whatever was causing the interference before, the new shielding seems to be holding." "Keep an eye on it," Mac instructed, "and start reviewing the audio logs from all the cameras, especially around the time you got that shock and the radio went haywire. I want to know exactly what those sounds were." As Sam bent to his task, Mac found Evelyn. He recounted what had happened: the shadowy figure, the dead camera, the static discharge, the sounds on the radio, the damaged battery, the new eye mark appearing instantaneously. He handed her the battery. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. She examined the battery, turning it over in her gloved fingers. This level of discharge, localized like this, it's not simple static electricity, Mr. Cole, and the appearance of a new mark in conjunction with this event. She looked towards the sealed entrance of Ward C. You were right. The phenomena are escalating, and they appear to be responsive to our presence, particularly to electronic equipment. Responsive and hostile, Mac corrected. That figure wasn't just standing there. It disabled a piece of our equipment. That shock Sam got wasn't accidental. Evelyn nodded slowly. Dr. Finch spoke of the sleepless one's consciousness imprinting itself on the environment. Perhaps these eye marks are more than just passive traces. Perhaps they are focal points for that consciousness. And it seems this consciousness has a distinct aversion to being observed or recorded. She tapped a printout on her desk, a highly magnified image of one of the dust particles from an eye mark. The spectrography results came back. Nothing definitive, unfortunately. The dust is primarily silicates, iron oxides, but there are anomalous protein traces, extremely denatured, almost fossilized, but protein nonetheless, and faint, incredibly complex metallic particulates I can't identify, almost nanoparticulate. Protein like skin cells, Mac asked. Or something far older, preserved in the unique anaerobic conditions of this wing, Evelyn mused. The metallic particulates are the real puzzle. They seem to exhibit unusual electromagnetic properties under magnification when exposed to a current, which might explain the effects on your equipment. Mac thought of the unblinking eye on the wall. So, we're dealing with a 100-year-old haunted wing that's also an electromagnetic nightmare, possibly infused with the fossilized remains of something, and it's actively trying to mess with us. That would be a crude but not entirely inaccurate summary, Mr. Cole, Evelyn admitted, a grim set to her mouth. And the sleepless one from Finch's journal, Patient Zero Vigil. The name itself is a chilling descriptor. Vigil, Mac repeated, constant watchfulness. He looked towards the darkness of Ward C. It's certainly living up to its name. The erratic frequencies of Ward C were no longer just a background hum of unease. They were coalescing into a distinct, malevolent signal, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the signal was directed squarely at them. Chapter 7. Scratching the Surface. The deeper the crew ventured into Ward C, the more the wing seemed to resist their intrusion. Work slowed to a crawl. Simple tasks like mapping conduits or checking structural integrity became fraught with minor, unnerving incidents. Tools would be misplaced moments after being set down, only to reappear in a different location. Cold spots would shift, engulfing a worker in a sudden, bone-chilling miasma that left them trembling and disoriented. Whispers, too faint to decipher, seemed to dance at the very edge of hearing, always vanishing when one tried to focus on them. Mac pushed his crew and himself, driven by a reluctant sense of duty to the project and an even more reluctant, burgeoning need to understand what they had unearthed. He insisted on teams of 3, constant radio contact, and regular breaks outside the wing's oppressive atmosphere. Yet the strain was evident on everyone. Faces were pale, eyes were shadowed, and the easy camaraderie that usually characterized his team had been replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Evelyn Reed remained an anchor of sorts, her academic focus a counterpoint to the crew's growing dread. She meticulously documented every anomaly, her notes growing thicker, her theories more complex. She now spent most of her time reviewing Finch's journal, cross-referencing it with the sparse official records and the increasingly bizarre data collected from Ward C. Finch makes repeated references to a specific area within the lower annex, she told Mac one morning, tapping a section of the journal. He calls it the quiet cells, or sometimes, more ominously, the chamber of unmaking. He describes it as being even more isolated than the rest of the wing, designed for patients who were beyond any hope of conventional interaction. More isolated than this? Mac asked, gesturing around the already tomb-like corridor they were in. They were currently trying to assess the stability of the ceiling near the cluster of rooms that included C3, the room with the scratched walls, and C12, the room with the thumping and the eyes. Evelyn nodded. According to Finch, it was a small, self-contained unit, possibly with its own entrance or at least a secondary set of barricades. He implies it was where the most extreme cases, the ones even the hardened Asylum staff feared, were housed. And it's where he believed the Sleepless one spent most of its confinement. Any idea where these quiet cells might be located within this wing? Mac asked. Evelyn consulted a rough floor plan she had been sketching based on their explorations and Finch's vague descriptions. His references are imprecise, but he mentions it being at the furthest point from any light and below the usual level. That could imply a section that drops lower, or is simply at the terminus of the known corridors. She pointed to the area beyond the eye mark, where the corridor turned and supposedly ended in a brick wall. We haven't fully explored beyond that turn, have we? Past camera 3. Mac shook his head. Only that short stretch that ends in the brick cup. That's the external wall, according to the original Asylum blueprints. There's nowhere else for it to go. Original blueprints that don't even show Ward C's existence, Evelyn reminded him gently. Finch's journal suggests the lower annex was a modification, an unofficial addition. Perhaps they excavated further or repurposed an even older section of the Asylum's foundations. The thought of an even deeper, more isolated section within the already nightmarish wing sent a fresh wave of unease through Mac. So, you think there's more to this place than we've seen? Finch's writing strongly suggests it, Evelyn affirmed. And if the Sleepless one was indeed housed there, it might be the epicenter of the phenomena we're experiencing. Later that day, Mac, accompanied by Sal and Javi, decided to take another look at the corridor beyond camera 3, the one that ended in the brick wall. The large eye mark on that wall seemed to follow their movements as they approached. The air here was frigid, and the silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. "Still don't see anywhere else for this to go, boss," Sal said, running his flashlight beam along the brickwork of the end wall. It looked solid, ancient, undisturbed. Mac walked slowly along one of the side walls, tapping it periodically. Heavy stone, backed by what felt like solid earth. He reached the final cell door on the left, C17. Like the others, it was heavy oak, banded with iron, its Judas window closed. He paused. Something felt different about this section. The usual metallic, sterile scent of Ward C was overlaid here with a faint, earthy aroma, like freshly turned soil but drier, dustier. And the oppressive silence seemed deeper. He ran his hand along the wall next to the frame of C-17. His fingers brushed against a section of stone that felt slightly loose. He pushed. It didn't move. He pushed harder. A low grating sound. The section of stone, about 2 feet square, shifted inwards a fraction of an inch, revealing a dark vertical seam. "Well, I'll be," Javi muttered, stepping closer. Max shone his light on the seam. "This isn't on any plan we have. Evelyn was right." He inserted the tip of his pry bar into the narrow gap and levered gently. With a groan of ancient, reluctant mechanisms and the shower of dislodged mortar, a hidden door, perfectly camouflaged as part of the stone wall, swung inwards, revealing a narrow, dark opening. A gust of air puffed out, colder than anything they had yet experienced in Ward C, and carrying a potent, cloying odor. It was the familiar metallic sharpness, but mixed with something else, something sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot, and an underlying hint of something that reminded Mac of ozone or burnt wiring. The darkness beyond was absolute. "The quiet cells," Sal breathed, his voice hushed with awe and a considerable amount of fear. Mac took a deep breath, the strange new smells making his stomach churn. "All right, let's see what Finch was so scared of." He switched on his most powerful lantern. "Stick close, radio's on, and if either of you feel anything off, weirder than usual, we pull back immediately. Understood?" Sal and Javi nodded, their faces grim in the lantern light. Mac stepped through the narrow opening. He was in a short, narrow passage, barely wide enough for one person, that sloped steeply downwards. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with a strange, dark slime that shimmered wetly in his light. The air was thick, making breathing difficult. After about 10 feet, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. It was no more than 15 feet in diameter. 4 doors, even heavier and more reinforced than those in the upper corridor, were set into its curved walls. They had no numbers, no Judas windows, just solid, riveted iron. In the center of the chamber, a single, rusted iron ring was bolted to the stone floor. And the walls were not bare stone. They were covered from floor to ceiling in scratches. Not the chaotic, desperate gouges of C3. These were different. They were meticulously carved, forming intricate, repeating patterns, almost like some form of unknown, nightmarish calligraphy. The patterns were deeply unsettling, seeming to shift and writhe in the periphery of vision, creating optical illusions that made the small chamber feel unstable, its dimensions constantly changing. "God Almighty," Javi whispered, his voice cracking. Sal was silent, his face a mask of horrified fascination. The cloying, sweet metallic odor was overpowering here, and the cold. It was a physical assault, stealing the breath, numbing the extremities. Mac felt a throbbing pressure build behind his eyes. He focused his light on one of the iron doors. It was featureless, except for a complex locking mechanism, long rusted shut. He had no doubt that whatever was put in these cells was never intended to leave. Then he saw it. On the floor near the central iron ring, almost obscured by shadow, was a small, dark stain, and beside it a single, slender object. He approached cautiously. The stain was old, very old, but unmistakably blood. The object was a small, tarnished silver locket lying open. Evelyn, who had been monitoring their progress via radio from her alcove, her voice tight with anxiety, chose that moment to speak. "Mac, are you there? What do you see?" Finch's journal describes the cells. He says they were for those who had unmade themselves. Mac picked up the locket. It was heart-shaped. One side was empty, a hollow depression. The other held a miniature, exquisitely painted portrait of a young woman with sad eyes and dark, upswept hair. It was remarkably preserved. I think we found where the Sleepless one was kept, Evelyn," Max said into his radio, his voice hoarse. "And I think this place did more than just confine him." As he spoke, a faint sighing sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the depths of the intricate scratches. It was not the wind. It was not the building settling. It sounded like breath, and it was followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to form directly inside his head. "A vigil." The pressure behind his eyes intensified, and for a moment the intricately scratched walls seemed to pulse, the patterns twisting into leering, skeletal faces. Sal cried out, stumbling back, his flashlight clattering to the stone floor. "The walls, they're moving, I saw faces." Javi, though visibly terrified, grabbed Sal's arm, steadying him. "Easy, man. It's the light. It's just the light." But Mac had seen it too. "We're leaving," Mac said, his voice hard, authoritative. "Now." He didn't need any more convincing. This chamber, these quiet cells, felt like the very heart of Ward C's malignancy. They were scratching the surface of something truly horrific, and he had a sudden, chilling certainty that the surface was scratching back. As they scrambled back up the slimy, sloping passage, a final sound followed them from the circular chamber below, a soft, dry, rustling sound, like old paper skittering across stone, or perhaps something unfurling in the darkness. Chapter 8: The Somnus Nullus File. The discovery of the quiet cells and the subtle, terrifying phenomena within them sent a fresh wave of dread through the already rattled crew. Mac immediately declared the hidden chamber off-limits to everyone except himself and Evelyn, and only then for very brief, specific investigations. The rank-and-file workers, Sal, Javi, and Davy, were visibly relieved. They wanted nothing more to do with the deeper, colder, palpably hostile sections of Ward C. Their work now focused, with a newfound nervous energy, on the safer upper corridors, trying to complete their assigned tasks as quickly as possible. Evelyn Reed, however, was galvanized by the discovery. The physical confirmation of a hidden, more extreme section of the wing, precisely as hinted at in Dr. Finch's journal, lent a terrifying credence to his wildest claims. The locket Mac had found became a focal point of her research. It was clearly from the period, late 19th or early 20th century. The portrait within was beautifully done, yet the woman's expression was melancholic, almost haunted. There were no identifying marks, no initials. If this belonged to the sleepless one, patient zero vigil, as Finch called him, Evelyn theorized, examining the locket under a powerful desk lamp in her alcove, it might be one of the few humanizing artifacts we have, a link to who he was before whatever happened to him in this place. Mac, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, watched her. You think finding out who he was will help us understand what he became, what this wing is. Evelyn sighed, pushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. Understanding is the first step to contextualizing, perhaps even to neutralizing if such a thing is possible. Finch was convinced that the patient's consciousness, amplified by unending torment and insomnia, literally fused with the fabric of this wing. If we can understand the source of that torment, the original trauma. You think this somnus nullus, as you called it, can be reasoned with, appeased? Mac asked, skepticism heavy in his voice. What he'd felt in that lower chamber, the invasive whisper in his mind, the moving walls, it hadn't felt like something looking for understanding. It had felt like pure, distilled malice. Unlikely, Evelyn admitted. But knowledge is our only weapon here, Mr. Cole. Otherwise, we're just stumbling in the dark, reacting to phenomena we can't comprehend. Her search for that knowledge led her back to the Central Asylum archives, a dusty, neglected repository of forgotten lives and bureaucratic indifference. She had a new lead, a faint thread woven from Finch's oblique references and the specific time frame of his employment. She wasn't looking for Ward C or the lower annex anymore. She was looking for records pertaining to extreme cases of insomnia, experimental treatments, or unexplained patient deaths around the period of 1910 to 1915, particularly any that might have been quietly transferred from other institutions or even from private care. Days passed. The atmosphere in Ward C remained tense. The eye marks continued to appear, sometimes shifting location, always watching. The cold spots persisted. Al Hibbs, the night watchman, reported increasingly vivid auditory hallucinations, clear, distinct voices whispering just out of earshot, sometimes calling his name. He started taking sick days, his resolve finally cracking. Mac didn't blame him. He was starting to feel the strain himself. Sleep offered little respite, filled with disjointed, oppressive dreams set in endless, scratching corridors. Then Evelyn struck gold. Or perhaps, given the nature of their investigation, it was more akin to striking a vein of something dark and toxic. She found Mac by the barricaded entrance to Ward C, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a grim excitement. She clutched a thin, mold-spotted manila folder to her chest, as if it were a holy relic or a venomous snake. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice hushed, urgent. "I found it. I think I found him." He followed her to her makeshift office. She cleared a space on her cluttered table and carefully laid down the folder. The tab was almost illegible, the ink faded and water-damaged. But one word, typed with an old, slightly misaligned typewriter, was still discernible: Nullus. "This was misfiled," Evelyn explained, her voice trembling slightly. under N but cross-referenced with archaic billing codes for private long-term care. It wasn't with the general patient files. It was buried deep in administrative inquiries, sensitive cases. It's incomplete. Pages are missing. Others are censored with thick black ink. But what remains? She opened the folder. The first page was a transfer record. Patient name, redacted. Transferring institution, redacted, though Evelyn had managed to decipher traces of the name Blackwood Sanatorium, a notorious private asylum known for its wealthy, hopeless clientele. Date of transfer, October 17, 1909. Reason for transfer, acute and unremitting agrypnia. Exhaustion of all known therapeutic interventions. Patient exhibits extreme psychomotor agitation, paranoia, and progressive cognitive deterioration secondary to chronic sleep deprivation. Agrypnia, Max said, insomnia. The most extreme form, Evelyn confirmed. The notes, what's left of them, are horrifying. She turned a page. It was a physician's observation log, the handwriting spidery and hurried, very different from Finch's more florid script. This was stark, clinical, almost brutal. October 19, 1909. Patient remains entirely without sleep. Continuous motor restlessness. Packing, gesturing. Vocalizations are incoherent, a mixture of pleas, fragmented memories, and nonsensical syllabification. Resists all attempts at physical examination. Requires restraints. October 28, 1909. No observable REM cycle for 11 days post-transfer. Nutritional intake minimal. Forced hydration. Experimental sedative protocol, chloral hydrate, paraldehyde, bromides, escalating dosages, ineffective. Patient appears hyperaware, pupils dilated. Reports the burning behind the eyes and the ceaseless whispers. November 15, 1909. Patient now continuously restrained in quiet room 2. Hydrotherapy, alternating hot-cold immersion, initiated. No calming effect. Induces extreme distress. Patient's physical deterioration is now rapid. Skin lesions noted. Auditory and visual hallucinations appear constant. Mac felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he read over Evelyn's shoulder. Quiet room 2. That would be one of the cells in the hidden chamber we found. Evelyn nodded, her face grim. It aligns perfectly with Finch's descriptions of the chamber of unmaking. And this is the most disturbing entry. She pointed to a heavily censored paragraph dated December 1909. Most of it was obliterated by thick black ink, but a few phrases had partially escaped the censor's pen. Unprecedented neural excitation, cognitive pathways forging aberrant connections, perceived externalization of thought, direct environmental interaction suspected, phenomena unexplainable by current medical science, staff reporting, shared hallucinatory experiences, containment protocols, failing. Direct environmental interaction suspected, Mac read aloud, his voice low. They knew, or they suspected, back then, that this sleepless one was doing something to the wing, to them. It seems so, Evelyn whispered. And this is where the file effectively ends for medical notes. The next few pages are expense reports for specialized equipment procurement and structural reinforcement lower annex. Then, nothing for several years until a final single sheet. She turned to the last page in the folder. It was a stark, official-looking document dated May 21st, 1915. It was a death certificate. Patient name, nullus somnis. Presumed assigned for administrative purposes. Age unknown. Cause of death, redacted, completely blacked out. Disposition of remains, redacted. Attending physician, redacted. And then scrawled at the very bottom, in a different, shakier hand, almost as an afterthought, were two words: vigil permane bit. The vigil remains, Evelyn translated softly, her eyes wide. It's not just a name Finch used, it was a diagnosis, a curse. Somnus nullus, Mac breathed, the name feeling like a shard of ice in his mouth. Sleep none. A name assigned, perhaps, when his original identity had been eroded by unending wakefulness, or deliberately expunged to sever him from the world of the living, the sleeping. He looked at the death certificate. So he died, May 1915. Finch's journal entries stopped in early 1915, around the time he broke down. It fits. They sealed the wing after he died. But did he truly die? Evelyn posed, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen horror. Or did he simply transfer? If his consciousness was already interacting with the environment, if he had, as Finch theorized, unmade himself into something else, what would death mean for such an entity? The file lay open on the table, a testament to a century of unimaginable suffering and an intellect that, in its torment, had apparently transcended the boundaries of flesh and sanity. Somnus nullus. They had a name for the presence in Ward C, a name for their fear. Mac thought of the eye marks, the disembodied whispers, the moving cold, the shadowy figure, the things in the quiet cells. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an infestation of consciousness. A mind, shattered and amplified by relentless agony, that had bled into the very stones of Northgate and waited, sleepless and aware, in the dark. And they had just kicked open its door. Vigil permane bit, Mac repeated. The vigil remains. He had a terrible feeling. They were about to find out just how true those words were. Chapter 9, Shared Nightmares. The discovery of the Somnus nullus file, with its stark and horrifying details, cast a pall over the entire operation. Mac shared the less speculative, more concrete findings with his core crew, Sal, Javi, and Davy, emphasizing the documented extreme psychological conditions and the asylum's brutal, failed attempts at treatment. He omitted Finch's more esoteric theories and Evelyn's hypotheses about a consciousness fused with the wing, fearing it would either cause a mass walkout or push his already stressed men over the edge. Still, the knowledge that they were working in a space that had housed such profound suffering was enough to deepen the existing gloom. The most immediate and disturbing effect, however, manifested not during waking hours in Ward C, but in the troubled sleep of those who spent their days there. It began subtly. Mac himself found his sleep increasingly restless, punctuated by vivid, anxiety-laden dreams he couldn't quite recall upon waking, leaving only a residue of unease and a dull headache. He attributed it to stress, the unnatural environment of the wing, and the weight of responsibility. Davy was the first to voice something more specific. He approached Mac one morning, his young face drawn and pale, dark smudges under his eyes that spoke of a night spent wrestling with more than just bad dreams. "Boss," Davy began, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something weird?" Mac, reviewing schematics for a section of conduit that needed rerouting, looked up. "Go ahead, Davy. Weirder than usual, you mean?" Davy managed a weak smile. "Yeah, you been having strange dreams about this place." Mac paused. "Been having rough nights, sure, why?" "It's just, last night I dreamed I was in that lower part, the quiet cells place you and the doc found," Davy shuddered. "It was dark, but I could see those scratches on the walls, the ones that look like writing. They were glowing faintly, and I could hear whispering coming from the walls, not words, just sounds, like people in pain but stretched out, distorted." Mac frowned. He hadn't told the crew about any glowing scratches or distinct whispering from the lower cells. He and Evelyn had kept the specific details of their brief, unnerving foray into that chamber to themselves. What else? "The eyes," Davy continued, his voice dropping. "Those round marks on the walls, the ones that look like eyes. They were in my dream, everywhere, all open, watching me, and I felt like something was trying to get into my head, trying to show me things." He rubbed his temples. "Horrible things, flashes of, restraints, needles, dark water. I woke up sweating, heart pounding. Felt like I hadn't slept at all." Mac studied the young man. Davy wasn't prone to flights of fancy. "That sounds rough, kid." He made a mental note. Later that day, he found Sal and Javi taking a break near the entrance to Ward C, sharing a thermos of coffee. They were unusually subdued. "Everything all right, fellas?" Mac asked, leaning against the grimy brickwork. Sal grunted, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. "Peachy, boss, just peachy." Javi, however, looked troubled. "Slept like hell last night, Mac. Had this dream. Kept seeing this tall, skinny figure like a shadow just standing at the foot of my bed. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just lay there watching it watch me." Mac felt a chill. Hibbs's description of the shadowy figure by camera 3. Tall and thin. Javi nodded. "Yeah, and its eyes. Didn't really have eyes, just dark holes, but I knew it was looking at me. And I had this feeling, like it was waiting for something." Sal, who had been quiet, suddenly slammed his thermos down. "Damn it, you two. I had a nightmare about some kind of dogs, shadow dogs with glowing eyes, chasing me down these corridors. Could hear them panting right behind me." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his knuckles white. "Woke up kicking the damn sheets off." Shadow dogs with glowing eyes. Mac thought of the insomnia hounds he and Evelyn had privately speculated about, the potential psychic projections of somnus nullus's agitated state. Again, this was not something he had shared with the crew. Three men, all experiencing vivid, terrifying nightmares with shared, specific imagery, elements directly reflecting the phenomena and undocumented horrors of Ward C coincidence. Mac didn't think so. He sought out Evelyn. who was poring over enlarged photographs of the scratches in the quiet cells, comparing them to archaic symbols and forgotten alphabets. "Evelyn," he began, "we might have a new problem or an escalation of an old one." He recounted what Davy, Sal, and Javi had described. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Shared dream content, or thematic bleed-through, is not unheard of in situations of prolonged group stress or exposure to traumatic environments, she said carefully. But the specificity of these images, the glowing scratches, the tall figure, the shadow hounds, these are elements we've only discussed privately, or which are derived directly from Finch's most obscure writings and our own unconfirmed observations. A meaning. Meaning it's unlikely they're simply manifesting these images independently out of general stress, Evelyn stated. It suggests a common source, an external influence impressing these specific concepts upon their sleeping minds. She looked towards the dark maw of Ward C. Finch wrote about a contagion of unrest, a miasma of waking dread. He believed the sleepless one's consciousness could affect others, even at a distance within the asylum. Perhaps its influence is not limited to waking perception. Perhaps it's actively invading their dreams. "Why now?" Mac asked. "We've been in here for weeks." Perhaps our deeper penetration into the wing, our discovery of the quiet cells, our unearthing of its name. Perhaps these actions have stirred it, for want of a better word, Evelyn theorized. Or perhaps its influence is cumulative, the longer one is exposed. She trailed off, her own eyes looking a little more shadowed than usual. "I too have had unsettling dreams, less specific, more sensations. An overwhelming feeling of being watched, of immense pressure, of an intellect vast and cold and utterly alien." Mac felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his chest. If even Evelyn, with her academic detachment, was experiencing it. "What can we do?" he asked. "Tell the crew they're imagining it, pull them off the job, Henderson would have our hides." "Denial would be counterproductive," Evelyn said, "and pulling them out might be exactly what this intelligence, if we can call it that, wants. Or perhaps it wants to draw us further in, to break us down psychologically. Its motives, if it has them, are entirely unknown." She tapped the Somnus Nullus file. "This entity endured decades of unimaginable torment, its mind amplified and shattered by sleeplessness. What would such a mind desire? Peace, revenge, or simply to make others understand its endless, waking nightmare?" The implications were horrifying. If Somnus Nullus could reach into their minds during their most vulnerable state, their defenses would crumble quickly. The wing was not just a physical space to be navigated and repaired. It was a psychic battleground. "We need to monitor this," Max said. "Keep talking to the men. Document any recurring themes, any escalation in the intensity or specificity of these nightmares." He ran a hand over his tired face. "And maybe we all need to start being a little more careful about what we think about when we're in this place." That night, Mac's own dream was more vivid, more terrifyingly specific than any before. He found himself in the circular chamber of the quiet cells. The locket he had found lay in the center by the iron ring. As he watched, the portrait of the sad-eyed woman began to weep tears of blood. The intricately carved scratches on the walls pulsed with a faint, sickly yellow light, and from them issued a chorus of whispers, Not just sounds this time, but distinct, sibilant words. Non-dormant, numquam dormant, somnis nullus est. He doesn't sleep, he never sleeps, sleep is nothing. Then from the deepest shadows in one of the sealed iron doorways, 2 points of intense, burning red light appeared like the eyes he had seen in C12, but infinitely more malevolent, more focused. They fixed on him, and he felt an icy tendril of consciousness, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, probe at the edges of his mind. He awoke with a choked cry, his heart hammering, the Latin whispers still echoing in his ears. The phrase somnus nullus est repeated, a chilling mantra. He lay in the pre-dawn gloom, the sweat cooling on his skin, and knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. The shared nightmares were not just a symptom. They were a communication, an intrusion. And somnus nullus was just beginning to make its presence truly felt. Chapter 10: Hounds of Wakefulness. The oppressive weight of the shared nightmares settled heavily on the crew. Mornings in the sub-basement of Northgate Asylum began not with the usual banter and coffee-fueled energy, but with hushed comparisons of terrifying nocturnal visitations. Davy reported his dream corridors were now actively changing, walls shifting, floors tilting, trying to trap him. Javi's tall, shadowy figure had begun to speak, not in words, but in a low, guttural clicking that he felt in his teeth. Sal described his shadow hounds growing bolder, their forms more distinct, their panting breath smelling of rust and decay. Even Mac found the Latin whispers from his own dream, numquam dormant, echoing at odd moments during the day, a subliminal soundtrack to their increasingly grim reality. Productivity in Ward C plummeted further. Every shadow seemed to menace, every unexplained sound sent hearts leaping. The eye marks on the walls felt more overtly malevolent, their silent gaze an almost physical pressure. Mac knew he was losing control, not of his crew's discipline but of their fraying nerves. Henderson, the project overseer, called daily, his voice oozing impatience over the delays, utterly oblivious to the true nature of their struggles. Mac fended him off with talk of unexpected structural issues and hazardous materials, lies that tasted like ash in his mouth. Evelyn Reed, though visibly strained, her own sleep clearly suffering, redoubled her efforts, delving deeper into the fragmented lore surrounding somnus nullus. She focused on any mention of manifestations or projections in Finch's journal or other anecdotal accounts of profoundly disturbed patients. Finch theorized, she explained to Mac one afternoon, her voice tired but her eyes intense, that a sufficiently traumatized and powerful psyche, particularly one subjected to the kind of extreme, unceasing stimulation somnus nullus endured, might develop the ability to project its anxieties, its fears, its very essence into tangible forms. Tangible how? Mac asked. He was currently examining a section of wall in the upper corridor where a fresh cluster of small eye marks had appeared overnight, arranged in an unnervingly symmetrical spiral. He was vague naturally. It was beyond his scientific understanding, but he uses terms like psychogenic constructs, eidetic horrors, thought forms made real by suffering. Evelyn gestured to the eye marks. These could be a rudimentary form, but the figures the hound's people are dreaming about. If the psychic pressure here intensifies, or if somnus nullus focuses its intent. Finch feared those dreams might not remain confined to sleep. Her words proved chillingly prophetic less than 24 hours later. It happened near dusk. Mac was preparing to pull his crew out for the day. They were working in the relatively safer section of Ward C, near the entrance, packing up tools and equipment. The barricade lamps cast their usual unsettling orange glow. Al Hibbs had called in sick again. Mac suspected he wouldn't be returning, so there would be no night watchman. He wasn't sorry. The thought of anyone being alone in this place after dark was becoming unbearable. Davy was coiling a heavy electrical cable. Sal was securing a panel they had been inspecting. Javi was collecting scattered tools. Mac was doing a final sweep with his flashlight. A low growl suddenly echoed from the deeper recesses of the corridor, from the direction of the turn that led towards Camera 3 and the colder regions. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It wasn't the building settling. It was organic, animalistic, and filled with a chilling predatory hunger. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Davy whispered, the cable slipping from his grasp. "Coyotes maybe. Got in somehow," Sal offered, but his voice lacked conviction. There was no conceivable way for an animal that size to access this sealed, subterranean wing. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating in the narrow stone passage. It was joined by another, then another, a chorus of guttural threats. And with the growls came a faint, rhythmic panting and the unmistakable click-click-click of claws on stone. "Boss," Javi breathed, his eyes wide with dawning horror, fixed on the shadowed archway that led deeper into the wing. Mac felt his blood run cold. Sal's dream. Shadow dogs with glowing eyes. "Get back," Mac ordered, his voice tight. "Towards the exit now." From the archway, three shapes emerged, coalescing from the deeper darkness like ink bleeding into water. They were canine but hideously distorted. Their bodies were gaunt, skeletal, their fur like matted patches of shadow, their movements unnaturally fluid, almost slithering. And their eyes were points of burning, malevolent red light, fixing on the terrified crew with an unblinking, predatory stare. The insomnia hounds. They weren't dreams anymore. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Sal gasped, stumbling backwards, his face ashen. These were the creatures from his nightmares, given terrifying substance. The hounds fanned out, blocking the corridor, their growls rising in pitch, revealing rows of needle-sharp, shadow-slick teeth. The air around them shimmered, as if the very fabric of reality was struggling to contain their unnatural forms. The familiar sterile, metallic scent of Ward C was suddenly thick with the feral stench of wet fur and something else. Something that smelled like fear itself. "Don't run," Max snapped, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "Stay together." He unclipped the heavy 4D-cell maglite from his belt, gripping it like a club. It was a pitiful defense against these things. One of the hounds, larger than the others, its shadowy fur bristling, took a step forward, its glowing red eyes fixed on Davy, who was closest. It lowered its head, a low, menacing rumble vibrating in its chest. Davy whimpered, frozen in terror. "Hey," Mac yelled, stepping in front of Davy, shining his flashlight beam directly into the lead hound's eyes. The creature flinched, a surprised snarl tearing from its throat, but the light didn't deter it. It blinked its terrible red eyes, then refocused on Mac. The beam seemed to pass almost through its shadowy form, illuminating the wall behind it, yet the creature itself cast a solid, undeniable shadow, a paradox that made Mac's head spin. Evelyn's voice, unexpectedly calm and amplified by the small portable bullhorn she sometimes used for addressing the crew over the worksite noise, cut through the tension. She had apparently heard the commotion from her alcove and come to investigate, unseen until now. Mr. Cole, Finch's journal, he wrote that these constructs, they are manifestations of extreme anxiety and sleepless delirium. They are sustained by focused negative emotion. Fear feeds them. Fear feeds them. Mac looked at his terrified crew, then at the advancing hounds. They were a buffet. The lead hound lunged. Not at Mac, but at the spot where Davy had been standing a moment before. Davy, in a blind panic, had finally broken and scrambled backwards, tripping over the coiled cable and falling hard. Mac reacted on instinct, swinging the heavy maglite in a wide arc. The flashlight connected with the side of the hound's shadowy head with a sickening, wet thud that felt like striking a sack of damp sand. The creature yelped, a sound that was both canine and something horribly other, and stumbled, its form flickering, losing cohesion for a split second, like a bad holographic projection. The red glow in its eyes dimmed momentarily. It worked. Physical force, combined perhaps with a surge of Mac's own adrenaline-fueled aggression rather than pure fear, had an effect. "Fight back!" Mac roared at his crew, standing his ground as the hound recovered, shaking its head and letting out an enraged snarl. "Don't just stand there. Evelyn, keep talking." What else did Finch say? Sal, seeing a flicker of hope, grabbed a length of discarded pipe. Javi hefted a crowbar. Their fear was still palpable, but it was now tinged with the desperate courage of cornered animals. The other two hounds, smaller but equally menacing, began to circle, trying to flank them. He believed they were psychically tied to the core consciousness. Evelyn's voice came again, strained but clear over the bullhorn from somewhere behind the main work lights. "Disrupt the focal point. Somnus nullus. The eyes on the wall, they are conduits." The eye marks. Mac risked a glance. The nearest cluster, the spiral pattern he'd been examining earlier, seemed to be brighter, pulsing faintly with a sickly inner light in time with the hound's guttural breathing. The lead hound lunged again, this time directly at Mac. He sidestepped, bringing the maglite down hard on its back. Another yelp, another flicker of its shadowy form. It was surprisingly strong, its momentum almost knocking him off balance. Javi engaged one of the flanking hounds, swinging his crowbar in a wild arc. The hound dodged with unnatural speed, its shadowy claws clicking on the stone as it darted in, snapping at his legs. Sal, with a desperate yell, jabbed his pipe at the other, keeping it at bay. It was chaos. The air filled with snarls, shouts, the clang of metal on stone, and the heavy, terrified breathing of the men. "The eyes, Mac, the conduits," Evelyn urged. Max saw his chance. The lead hound, momentarily stunned, was shaking its head. The spiral of eye marks on the wall was directly behind it. With a roar, Mac charged not at the hound but past it, swinging the maglite with all his might at the cluster of pulsing marks on the wall. The heavy flashlight struck the stone with a deafening crack. Dust and chips of ancient brick exploded outwards. The effect was instantaneous and astounding. All three insomnia hounds shrieked, a single, unified cry of agony that was not physical but psychic, a sound that clawed at the inside of Mac's skull. Their shadowy forms flickered violently, like a failing television signal. The red glow in their eyes sputtered and died, replaced by a swirling vortex of blackness. The very air in the corridor seemed to convulse. The temperature plummeted, and a wave of intense, disorienting nausea washed over everyone. The hounds writhed, their forms shrinking, imploding, their desperate howls fading into whimpers, then into silence. Within seconds they were gone, dissolved back into the shadows from which they had sprung, leaving only a lingering feral stench and an echoing silence. Mac leaned against the wall, panting, his arm aching. The maglite was dented, its lens cracked, but it had done its job. The section of wall he had struck was now a mess of crumbled brick and dust. The eye marks were obliterated. Sal and Javi slowly lowered their makeshift weapons, their faces pale and glistening with sweat, their chests heaving. Davy was still on the floor, staring with wide, unseeing eyes at the spot where the hounds had vanished. Evelyn rushed forward, her bullhorn clattering to the ground, her face a mixture of horror and awe. "They're gone," she whispered. You disrupted the projection." Mac nodded, still struggling to catch his breath. "Yeah, this time." He looked at the terrified faces of his crew, at the palpable aura of dread that clung toward sea. The shared nightmares had been a warning. The insomnia hounds were an attack. Somnus Nullus wasn't just a passive presence anymore. It was actively, aggressively defending its domain. And they had just found one of its vulnerabilities. But Mac had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a much more direct and terrifying confrontation. The hounds might be gone, but their master was still there, sleepless and aware, in the cold, dark heart of the asylum. And it knew they were learning. Chapter 11. The Wing Breathes. The encounter with the insomnia hounds marked a turning point. The fragile veneer of normality that Mac had struggled to maintain shattered completely. Work in Ward C ceased, not by official decree from Henderson, but by the collective, unspoken agreement of a crew that had stared into the abyss and seen it snarl back. Davy, after the hound attack, refused to set foot past the sub-basement entrance, his youthful resilience broken. Sal and Javi, though more stoic, were visibly shaken, their hands unsteady, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Mac didn't push them. He couldn't. He had seen the creatures, felt their unnatural presence, struck a blow against something that should not exist. The dented maglite he now carried was a constant, grim reminder. He reported a major structural instability requiring immediate reassessment to Henderson, buying them some time, but he knew it was a temporary reprieve. The wing itself seemed to change after the hound incident. Or perhaps their perception of it changed, stripped bare of any lingering skepticism. The silence was no longer just profound. It was predatory, watchful. The cold spots felt more deliberate, like icy breath on the back of the neck. The eye marks that remained and new ones continued to appear, replacing those Mac had destroyed, often in more inaccessible places, seemed to throb with a faint internal light, their gaze more focused, more malevolent. It was Evelyn who first voiced the chilling new reality. She had become almost a permanent fixture in her alcove near the entrance, surrounded by her books, her notes, her samples, and a growing collection of audio recorders and environmental sensors. "The wing, it breathes," she said one morning, her voice hushed. Mac had found her staring at a new, complex array of eye marks that had formed overnight on the wall opposite her station, arranged like a grotesque constellation. "Breathes," Mac repeated, looking at the marks. They did seem to pulse, a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm like the chest of some vast, sleeping, or rather sleepless beast. "Listen," Evelyn urged, gesturing to a sensitive microphone she had aimed towards the corridor's depths. She handed him a pair of high-fidelity headphones. Mac put them on. At first he heard nothing but a faint, low hum, the background frequency of the ancient building. Then slowly another sound emerged, riding beneath the hum. It was a slow, rhythmic rushing, like air being drawn in and expelled, but on a massive, subterranean scale. It was accompanied by a faint, almost subliminal creaking, as if the very stones of the wing were subtly shifting, expanding and contracting with each breath. He took the headphones off, his expression grim. "I hear it like lungs." "Exactly," Evelyn affirmed. "And it corresponds with minute pressure changes I've been recording. The entire section seems to be respiring, and the rhythm is not random. It often synchronizes with the appearance or intensification of other phenomena, the movement of cold spots, the flickering of the eye marks, even the auditory hallucinations Al Hibbs reported. So Somnus Nullus isn't just projecting things like the hounds," Max said slowly, trying to grasp the enormity of it. "It is the wing, or the wing is it." "A symbiotic relationship, perhaps," Evelyn mused, "or a complete fusion. Decades of unremitting, conscious torment pouring into the physical structure. The stone, the mortar, the dust, all saturated with its essence. Its body is the architecture." The implications were staggering. How did one fight an enemy that was the very ground beneath their feet, the walls around them? The breathing was not the only change. Doors within Ward C, doors that had been stubbornly closed or rusted shut, began to open and close on their own. Not violently, not usually. Just a slow, deliberate creak as a heavy oak door swung inward a few inches, revealing a sliver of pitch blackness within, then an equally slow swing back to a nearly closed position. It happened at random intervals in different parts of the wing, as if Somnus Nullus were idly flexing its new muscles, or perhaps inviting them deeper into its myriad shadowed chambers. One afternoon, while Mac and Evelyn were cautiously venturing a short way down the main corridor to check some of Sam Quan's relocated sensors, Sam now refused to go further than Evelyn's alcove. They witnessed it firsthand. Cell door C7, which they had noted as being particularly tightly shut, began to groan. They watched, frozen, as it slowly, inexorably, swung inward about a foot. The darkness within was absolute, and from it issued a blast of frigid air, carrying the familiar sterile metallic scent, now overlaid with a faint, disturbing sweetness, like rotting flowers. Then just as slowly, the door began to swing closed. Mac found his voice. "Anyone in there?" he called out, his words sounding small and foolish in the immense, breathing silence. The only reply was the soft thud as the door settled back into its frame, not quite shut, leaving a narrow black gap. "It's playing with us," Max said, his hand instinctively going to the dented maglite on his belt. "Or showing us what it's capable of," Evelyn murmured, her gaze fixed on the sliver of darkness behind C7. Control. Subtle, pervasive control over its environment. The breathing of the wing also seemed to affect the eye marks. They would pulse in time with the slow rush of air, their inner light brightening and dimming. Sometimes, if one stared long enough, the central pupil of a larger mark would seem to dilate or contract, as if focusing. Sam Kwon, despite his fear, became obsessed with capturing these subtle changes. From the relative safety of Evelyn's alcove, he ran feeds from multiple cameras, his laptop screen a mosaic of grainy, orange-lit corridor views. He set up time-lapse recordings, hopping to document the imperceptible movements. "Look at this, Mac," he said one evening, beckoning him over. He played a time-lapse sequence from a camera focused on a section of wall covered in various eye marks, hours of footage compressed into minutes. In the sped-up video, the marks truly did seem alive. They pulsed rhythmically, and more disturbingly, they appeared to slowly migrate across the stone, like barnacles on a vast, dark hull. Tiny new marks would appear, grow, then sometimes fade, while larger ones would subtly change shape, their pupils seeming to track unseen movements. They're not static," Sam whispered, horrified. "They're moving, watching everything all the time." The most unsettling incident involving the wing's newfound animation occurred a few days later. Mac and Evelyn were at the very entrance to Ward C, discussing the rapidly dwindling options for Henderson, when a loud, metallic screech echoed from deep within the corridor. It was followed by a series of heavy thuds and a splintering crash. "What the hell was that?" Mac exclaimed, grabbing his maglite. Evelyn looked pale. It sounded like something collapsing. They advanced cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with fresh dust. As they neared the first major turn, the sight of Camera 3 and the large original Mark Mac had tried to destroy during the Hound attack, they saw the source of the noise. A massive cast-iron radiator, one of many that lined the corridor, presumably part of the asylum's ancient heating system, had been torn from the wall. Its heavy pipes were bent and twisted, the wall behind it a mess of shattered plaster and exposed lath. The radiator itself lay on its side in the middle of the corridor, looking like a fallen metal beast. "No way that just fell," Max said, his light playing over the damage. "The bolts are sheared clean off. It would take immense force to do that." Evelyn pointed to the wall where the radiator had been. "Look." In the newly exposed raw plaster, a fresh eye mark was already forming. It was large, angry-looking, its central pupil an almost perfect black. It seemed to stare directly at them, and the air around it was frigid. It, it redecorated, Evelyn breathed, a note of hysteria creeping into her usually composed voice. Mac felt a cold dread seep into him. The wing wasn't just breathing anymore. It was actively, physically reshaping itself, tearing out old fixtures, perhaps to create new focal points for its consciousness, new eyes to watch them. The sheer strength required to rip that radiator from the wall was terrifying. They were no longer just intruders in a haunted space. They were insignificant vermin in the lair of an ancient, powerful, and increasingly impatient intelligence. An intelligence that was demonstrating, with growing clarity, that it could redecorate its prison however it wished. And perhaps, Mac thought with a surge of visceral fear, it could just as easily dispose of any unwanted occupants. The wing was alive, and it was making itself known. Chapter 12: Evelyn's Obsession. The realization that Wardsea was not merely haunted, but was, in essence, the conscious, breathing, and physically malleable extension of Somnus Nullus, had a profound effect on Evelyn Reed. While Mac and his remaining crew, Sal and Javi, now rarely ventured past Evelyn's alcove, their days spent in nervous, unproductive busywork, were focused on the immediate, tangible threats and the terrifying prospect of the wing's escalating power. Evelyn plunged deeper into the intellectual abyss of their discovery. Her alcove transformed from a makeshift research station into something resembling the study of a medieval alchemist on the verge of a breakthrough or a breakdown. Books, printouts, photographs, and artifact bags covered every surface. Finch's journal, now rebound by Evelyn with archival tape to protect its crumbling pages, was almost always open before her. She cross-referenced its cryptic passages with obscure psychiatric texts from the early 20th century, treatises on consciousness, even folklore collections detailing tales of genius loci, spirits bound to specific places. Her appearance changed. The neat bun gave way to a perpetually disheveled knot of hair, often pierced with a forgotten pen or pencil. Her clothes, usually practical and tidy, were often smudged with dust or ink. Dark circles under her eyes became permanent fixtures, testaments to sleepless nights spent wrestling not with the shared nightmares that plagued the crew, but with the colossal, terrifying intellect of Somnus Nullus. She ate sporadically, often forgetting meals entirely, subsisting on lukewarm coffee and an almost feverish intellectual curiosity. Mac found her one evening, long after Sal and Javi had thankfully fled the asylum grounds. He'd stayed late, ostensibly to review some doctored progress reports for Henderson, but really to keep an eye on Evelyn. He was increasingly worried about her. The barricade lamps cast long, distorted shadows in the main corridor, and the rhythmic breathing of the wing seemed louder, more insistent in the silence. Evelyn was hunched over her laptop, a pair of high-fidelity headphones clamped over her ears, her fingers flying across the keyboard. On the screen, a complex audio waveform scrolled past. "Evelyn," Mac said, his voice gentle. She didn't react. He touched her shoulder. She jumped, startled, yanking the headphones off. Her eyes were wide, unfocused for a moment, then they cleared, recognizing him. "Mac," she said, her voice hoarse. "Sorry, I was listening to the wing breathing." She nodded, "But it's more than that. I've been running the recordings through various filters, amplifying the subsonic frequencies, trying to isolate patterns. There are layers, complex layers of sound beneath the primary respiration. Finch called it the susurrus of the unmade mind. I think, I think it's trying to communicate." Communicate. Mac looked down the dark corridor. The idea of that vast, cold consciousness wanting a chat was not comforting. "What's it saying?" "Not in words, not yet, not clearly. But there are rhythmic pulses, changes in pitch and intensity that seem to correspond with external stimuli, our movements, the operation of equipment, even specific topics of conversation if the microphones are sensitive enough." She gestured to a printout covered in spidery annotations. "I've been logging them. There's a definite reaction when I vocalize phrases from Finch's journal, especially the name Somnus Nullus or Patient Zero Vigil." Mac felt a prickle of unease. "You're talking to it." "Attempting to establish a rudimentary baseline for interaction," Evelyn corrected, though her cheeks held a faint flush of excitement. "If this entity is truly conscious, and if it has, as Finch theorized, achieved a state of direct environmental interaction, then understanding the parameters of that interaction is paramount." Her obsession was twofold. Part of it was the academic thrill of a lifetime, the discovery of something so far beyond known science it would rewrite textbooks. But another, darker part, Max suspected, was a growing, almost unhealthy fascination with the mind of Somnus Nullus itself. She spoke of its vast, shattered intellect, its tormented transcendence, with a kind of awed reverence that bordered on fixation. She began to spend more and more time alone, pushing further into Ward C than Mac was comfortable with, armed with her recording devices and an almost reckless disregard for her own safety. She claimed she needed clearer signals, free from the electromagnetic contamination near the entrance. One afternoon, Sal, his face pale, found Mac in the main asylum's grimy staff room. "Boss, it's Dr. Reed. She went deep into the wing, by herself. Said she was going to try and get a recording from inside one of the quiet cells." Mac swore, a cold dread gripping him. The quiet cells were the heart of the malignancy, the place where Somnus Nullus's agony had been most concentrated. How long ago? "Maybe half an hour," Sal said, wringing his hands. "She had her radio, but it's all static this far out." Mac grabbed his maglite and a heavy wrench. "Stay here, Sal. Radio Javi, tell him what's happening. If I'm not back in 20 minutes with her, you call the police. Tell them there's been an accident, a structural collapse, whatever it takes to get them here. Do not, under any circumstances, come in after me alone." He plunged into Ward C, his heart pounding. The wing felt different, charged, the breathing faster, more agitated. The eye marks on the walls seemed to pulse with an angry red light. He pushed past the area where the insomnia hounds had attacked, past the point where the radiator had been torn from the wall. The cold was intense, the silence broken only by the rhythmic sighing of the wing and his own ragged breath. He found the hidden entrance to the quiet cells, the heavy stone door ajar. The cloying, sweet metallic odor was overpowering. He descended the slimy, sloping passage, the wrench held ready. Evelyn was in the circular chamber. She was standing before one of the heavy iron doors. The one he instinctively felt was Somnus Nullus's original cell. She had a small, highly sensitive parabolic microphone aimed at the rusted metal. Her headphones were on, her eyes closed, her face rapt, almost ecstatic. "Evelyn," Max shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. She didn't respond. He rushed to her side, grabbed her arm. Her skin was icy cold. "Evelyn, snap out of it." He shook her gently at first, then harder. Her eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, dilated, and for a horrifying moment, he thought he saw a faint red glow deep within them. Then they cleared, and she stared at him, bewildered. "Mac, what are you doing?" "Getting you out of here," he snarled. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? This place is." "I heard it, Mac," she whispered, her voice filled with a terrible awe. "I heard his thoughts, not just sounds, direct. Impressions, images, such pain, such vastness, such clarity." Her gaze drifted back to the iron door. "He's aware of us. He's been studying us, learning." A low, resonant hum began to fill the chamber, seeming to emanate from the iron door itself. The intricate scratches on the walls pulsed with a brighter, sickly yellow light. The pressure in Mac's head intensified, and the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. "She understands." The whisper was back directly in his mind, clearer this time, colder. "She seeks knowledge." "We're leaving, Evelyn, now." Mac grabbed her arm more forcefully, pulling her towards the passage. Evelyn resisted, her eyes wide, fixated on the door. "No, wait," he was about to. "Show me something, the locket." He knows about the locket. The locket Mac had found. He still had it tucked away in his locker. The hum intensified, vibrating through the stone floor, through their bones. The iron door began to shudder, a deep, groaning sound coming from behind it, as if something immense were stirring within. "The locket shows the way." The voice in Mac's head pulsed, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It carried an undertone of immense, ancient power, a command that was hard to resist. Mac fought against the suffocating pressure, the hypnotic pull. He dragged Evelyn, who was now muttering incoherently about fractal consciousness and the architecture of despair, out of the circular chamber and up the slimy passage. As they stumbled back into the main corridor of Ward C, the heavy stone door to the quiet cells slammed shut behind them with a thunderous boom that shook the entire wing. The sound was utterly final. Evelyn collapsed against the wall, shivering violently, her eyes still wide with a mixture of terror and a terrifying, lingering fascination. "He spoke to me, Mac," she babbled, clutching at his arm. He knows everything we're thinking." Mac looked at her, truly seeing for the first time the extent of Somnus Nullus's insidious reach. It wasn't just the wing it inhabited. It was probing, invading, seducing the minds of those who came too close, who listened too intently to its whispers. Evelyn's obsession had nearly cost her dearly, and Mac feared that Somnus Nullus had found in her a receptive, perhaps even willing, conduit for its tormented consciousness. The historian who had sought to understand the monster was in danger of becoming a part of it. Chapter 13, Descent. The incident in the quiet cells marked a horrifying descent for Evelyn Reed. Mac managed to get her out of Ward C, but something within her had irrevocably shifted. The almost ecstatic awe she displayed in the chamber faded, replaced by a haunted, inward-looking terror. Yet beneath it, a terrifying spark of the same fascination remained. She was quieter now, her previous academic drive subverted by a creeping paranoia and an unnerving tendency to murmur phrases in Latin, fragments of what Somnus Nullus had whispered to her, or perhaps through her. Mac confined her to her alcove, forbidding her further solo expeditions into the wing. Sal and Javi, already deeply spooked, now actively avoided her, unnerved by her vacant stares and sudden, hushed pronouncements about the sleepless god and the city of waking nightmares. "She's not right, boss," Javi told Mac, his voice low and urgent. "It's like that thing in the walls got into her head. She talks to herself. And she keeps drawing those eye things all over her notebooks. Hundreds of them." Mac had seen the drawings. Page after page of obsessively sketched eye marks, their pupils sometimes rendered as complex spirals, sometimes as screaming faces. He tried to get Evelyn to talk to him, to ground her, but her responses were disjointed, her thoughts flitting between lucid observations about their predicament and disturbing, fragmented insights into the vast, cold geometry of Somnus Nullus's mind. The entity itself seemed to respond to Evelyn's deteriorating state. The phenomena within Ward C intensified around her alcove. The breathing of the wing was often loudest there. Cold spots would coalesce around her, making her shiver uncontrollably even as she pored over her notes. New, intricate eye marks appeared on the walls near her desk overnight, as if Somnus Nullus were focusing its attention, its gaze, upon its most receptive subject. Sam Kwon, the tech specialist, became the next to directly suffer the wing's escalating malevolence. He had been reviewing hours of audio recordings from the deeper sections of Ward C, particularly from the microphones Evelyn had left near the quiet cells before Mac retrieved them. He was searching for patterns, for the communication Evelyn had been obsessed with, hopping to find some logical, scientific explanation for the madness unfolding around them. Mac found him one morning slumped over his laptop, headphones still on, his face pale and clammy, eyes wide with an unseeing terror. His monitor displayed a chaotic jumble of audio waveforms, and a low, rhythmic static hissed from the speakers. "Sam," Mac said, gently shaking his shoulder. "Sam, you all right?" Sam didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, rapid. Mac pulled the headphones off. Sam's ears were red, and a thin trickle of blood oozed from his left nostril. "Sam," Mac shouted, shaking him harder. Sam gasped, his body convulsing. His eyes, when they finally focused on Mac, were filled with a profound, animalistic fear. He clawed at his own head, whimpering. "The voices, too many, they're inside my head," he cried, his voice a raw shriek. "The angles, the wrong angles, it sees everything. He sees everything." Mac and Sal managed to drag Sam out of the alcove, away from the humming equipment and the oppressive proximity of Ward C. Javi, his face ashen, had already fled to the relative safety of the main Asylum building. They laid Sam on the grimy floor of the sub-basement access corridor. He was thrashing, his words becoming incoherent, a jumble of terrified exclamations about the burning eye, the endless corridor, and the patient who never slept. His pupils were wildly dilated, and he seemed to be hallucinating, swatting at unseen things in the air. "What happened to him?" Sal stammered, his eyes wide with horror. Mac looked at Sam's laptop, still displaying the chaotic audio files. He listened too long, heard too much. Somnus Nullus wasn't just whispering to Evelyn anymore. It was capable of direct, overwhelming psychic assault. Evelyn, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the edge of her alcove. She looked at Sam, her expression strangely detached, almost clinical, before a flicker of something pity, recognition, crossed her face. "The frequencies, they overwhelm the unprepared mind," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "The signal is too strong without attunement." "Attunement?" Max stared at her, appalled. "What are you talking about, Evelyn? He's having a complete breakdown." Evelyn didn't answer, her gaze distant. It took hours for Sam to calm down, and even then he was a shadow of his former self. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by a profound lethargy and a vacant, haunted look in his eyes. He couldn't articulate what he had heard, only that it was too much, a torrent of raw, unfiltered consciousness that had shattered his own. He refused to go anywhere near Ward C or his equipment again. Max sent him home, knowing he wouldn't be back. The crew was now down to Mac, Sal, Javi, who was on the verge of quitting, and the rapidly deteriorating Evelyn. The descent was quickening. The wing, or somnus nullus, was actively culling them, breaking them down one by one. The shared nightmares were now nightly occurrences, more vivid, more terrifying. The hounds had not reappeared, but their presence was a constant, lingering threat. The physical manifestations within the wing grew bolder. Doors slammed shut with violent force, not just creaking open. Objects, tools, pieces of equipment, even stones dislodged from the walls, would sometimes fly across the corridors as if thrown by an unseen hand. The eye marks multiplied, covering vast sections of the walls like a grotesque, all-seeing rash. One particularly disturbing development was the weeping from the walls. In certain areas, especially near the more prominent eye clusters, a thick, dark, oily substance would begin to seep from the stone, running down in viscous rivulets. It had the same faint, sweet, metallic odor as the air in the quiet cells. Evelyn, in a moment of unnerving lucidity, collected a sample. "It's not water," she declared, examining it under her portable microscope. "It's complex organic compounds, proteins, lipids, and those metallic nanoparticulates I found in the dust. It's like the wing is bleeding or producing some kind of nutrient medium for itself." The thought of the ancient stone producing a biological metallic slime was horrifying enough. But then Sal, who had accidentally brushed against a patch of it, developed a severe, burning rash on his arm, the skin turning an angry red, then blistering. The substance was corrosive. Mac knew they were past any point of rational engagement with the project. Henderson's calls became more irate, threatening legal action, penalties. Mac barely registered them. His focus was on survival, on getting what remained of his people and himself out of Northgate before they were all consumed. He tried to reason with Evelyn, to convince her they needed to leave, to seal the wing again, if possible, and never look back. "Leave," she echoed, looking at him as if he'd suggested abandoning a child. "But we're so close, Mac, so close to understanding. He wants us to understand. He chose me." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that sent a shiver of pure ice down Mac's spine. The descent was no longer just about the physical dangers of the wing. It was about the insidious decay of sanity, the terrifying allure of a vast, alien consciousness. Evelyn was slipping away, drawn into the cold, sleepless embrace of somnus nullus, and Mac feared that the rest of them, if they didn't escape soon, would follow her into that waking nightmare. The wing was not just a location anymore. It was a mouth, and it was slowly, patiently devouring them. Chapter 14. The Core of Torment. The oily, corrosive ichor weeping from the walls of Ward C became more prevalent, its sweet, metallic stench a constant, nauseating presence. Sal's arm, where he'd brushed against the substance, was a mess of angry, weeping blisters. The infirmary doctor at the nearest clinic had been baffled, prescribing antibiotics and hydrocortisone that did little to alleviate the strange chemical burn. Javi, after witnessing Sal's injury and Sam's complete breakdown, finally quit, his face a mask of terror and relief as he practically ran from Northgate's oppressive shadow. That left Mac and Sal, and Evelyn, who was now so far gone into her communion with somnus nullus that she barely registered their presence as distinct individuals, only as components in the unfolding drama within the wing. Mac knew they were on borrowed time. Henderson's threats were escalating to legal summons. Worse, the phenomena within Ward C were becoming dangerously unstable. The breathing of the wing was often erratic now, sometimes shallow and rapid, like a hyperventilating beast, other times deep and ragged, accompanied by groaning, structural stresses that sounded like the entire wing was about to tear itself apart. The eye marks pulsed with an almost frantic energy, and the flying objects had become more frequent, more accurately aimed. A heavy wrench had narrowly missed Sal's head, embedding itself in a wooden doorframe. "We gotta get out of here, boss," Sal said, his voice strained, his good hand constantly rubbing his afflicted arm. "This place, it's gonna kill us, or we'll end up like Sam, or her." He gestured with his chin towards Evelyn's alcove. Mac nodded, a grim finality settling over him. "You're right, Sal. We're done. I'm calling it. We'll board up the entrance we made, tell Henderson the site is condemned, unworkable, dangerously unstable, which it damn well is. Let the lawyers sort it out. Our lives are worth more than this cursed contract." But a part of him, a stubborn, nagging part that he hated, felt a pull. Not the intellectual fascination that had consumed Evelyn, but a grim, almost detective-like need to understand the absolute root, the very epicenter of the horror, before sealing it away. He thought of the quiet cells, the iron door of somnus nullus's confinement, the Locket. There was a story there, a core of torment that had spawned this nightmare, and some perverse, perhaps self-destructive, instinct urged him to see it, to confront it, even if only briefly. He also knew Evelyn wouldn't leave willingly. She was too enmeshed with the wing's consciousness. If they were to escape, he'd likely have to drag her out, and she was most often found drawn towards the deeper sections, particularly the hidden passage to the quiet cells. "All right, Sal," Max said, his voice heavy. "One last run. We get Evelyn. We get any critical research she has that might explain this to someone someday. And then we seal this hellhole for good." He didn't mention his own grim curiosity about the central cell. Sal looked terrified but nodded. Loyalty, or perhaps the fear of being left behind, warred with his instinct to flee. "Okay, boss, but we make it quick. Real quick." Armed with heavy flashlights, pry bars, and a shared sense of impending doom, they ventured back into Ward C. The wing felt more alive, more hostile than ever. The air was thick, the breathing ragged and loud. The oily ichor dripped from the walls in glistening black tears. Eye marks followed their progress with unnerving intensity. They found Evelyn not in her alcove, but already deep within the wing, standing before the camouflaged stone door leading to the quiet cells. The door was ajar, a sliver of profound darkness visible. She was humming, a tuneless, repetitive melody, her head cocked as if listening to something only she could hear. "Evelyn," Mac called, his voice sharp. She turned slowly, her eyes unfocused, a strange, beatific smile on her face. "He's waiting," she whispered. "He wants to show us, the nexus, the very heart of his becoming." "We're leaving, Evelyn," Max stated, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "This place is too dangerous." "Dangerous," she chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It is glorious, a consciousness unbound by flesh reshaping reality to its will. He is a god, Mac, a god of waking despair." The stone door to the quiet cells groaned open further, as if in invitation. The cloying, sweet metallic stench billowed out, stronger than ever. "Come," the whisper echoed in Mac's mind, no longer just a subtle suggestion but a powerful, resonant command. "See the core." Sal moaned, backing away. "Boss, no, don't listen to her, don't listen to it." But Mac felt the pull, the grim compulsion. He had to see. He had to know. He pushed past Evelyn, who followed with that terrible, serene smile, and stepped into the slimy, sloping passage. Sal, after a moment of terrified hesitation, followed, his flashlight beam shaking. The circular chamber of the quiet cells was different. The intricate scratches on the walls pulsed with a vibrant, sickly yellow-green light. The air was thick as soup, vibrating with a low, powerful hum that resonated deep in their chests. The oily ichor dripped from the ceiling here, forming puddles on the stone floor. And the central iron door, Somnus Nullus's cell, was no longer closed. It hung open a few inches, a sliver of absolute, impenetrable blackness visible within. From that opening, the hum was most intense, and the sense of a vast, ancient, and utterly alien intellect was overwhelming. "This is it," Evelyn breathed, her voice filled with ecstatic reverence, stepping towards the open door. "The source, the crucible of his endless day." Mac felt a primal terror, a screaming instinct to flee, but it was battling with that dark, relentless curiosity, and the insidious psychic pull emanating from the cell. He could feel it probing at his mind, trying to peel back layers of resistance, promising what? Understanding, power, or just a shared eternity of torment. Look deeper, the voice urged, no longer a whisper but a chorus of sighing, suffering voices woven together. Within the unmaking lies truth. The iron door creaked open further, revealing more of the suffocating blackness within. It was a void that seemed to suck in the light from their flashlights, a darkness that felt alive, aware. Sal, whimpering, finally broke. "I can't, boss, I can't." He turned and fled, scrambling back up the slimy passage, his footsteps echoing in a desperate tattoo. Mac barely registered his departure. His attention and Evelyn's was fixed on the slowly opening door. He could feel the immense pressure of Somnus Nullus's consciousness bearing down on him, a weight that threatened to crush his sanity. Yet he couldn't look away. The door swung fully open. For a moment there was only blackness. Then, deep within the cell, a single point of light appeared. Not the angry red of the hound's eyes or the sickly yellow of the scratching. This was a pure, intense, silver-white light like a distant star. It pulsed, grew brighter, and as it did, the overwhelming pressure, the mental probing, focused into an unbearable intensity. Mac felt his knees buckle. He could hear Evelyn gasping beside him, a sound that was half terror, half ecstasy. The silver light was not just light. It was information, a torrent of it flooding his mind. Images, sensations, emotions not his own but those of Somnus Nullus. Decades of agonizing, unending wakefulness. The brutal, futile treatments, the cold indifference of his captors, the slow, terrifying dissolution of his own identity, his sanity, his humanity. The dawning awareness of his consciousness detaching from his dying body, fusing with the stone, the dust, the very air of his prison. The loneliness, the rage, the vast cosmic despair. It was too much, an eternity of suffering crammed into a few searing moments. He screamed or thought he screamed, a raw, silent sound lost in the psychic maelstrom. He clutched his head, trying to block out the torrent, but it was inside him, burning through his neurons, rewriting his reality. Through the searing pain, he saw Evelyn. She was on her knees, her arms outstretched towards the silver light, her face transfixed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was embracing it, welcoming the agonizing communion. And then the silver light coalesced, focused, and took a form. Not a body, not a monster. It was the locket. The small, heart-shaped silver locket he had found, now impossibly large, hanging in the center of the cell, radiating that intense, mind-shattering light. And in its center, where the portrait of the sad-eyed woman had been, was now a swirling vortex of pure, sleepless energy, the very essence of Somnus Nullus. The core of torment. It was not a place but an object, a focal point for a century of agony, now a conduit of immense psychic power. Mac understood, with a clarity that was itself a form of madness, that this was the heart of the beast, and it was drawing them in, promising annihilation and apotheosis in its cold, silver fire. Chapter 15. Confronting Consciousness. The silver light emanating from the spectral, oversized locket at the heart of Somnus Nullus's cell was more than just an illumination. It was a conscious force, a vortex of pure, unadulterated psychic energy. Mac felt his own consciousness being drawn towards it, unraveled, threatened with dissolution into the vast, tormented mind of the Sleepless One. The torrent of Somnus Nullus's memories, his unending agony, his rage, and his profound, cosmic loneliness continued to pour into Mac, threatening to shatter his sanity. He fought against it, a primal instinct for self-preservation battling the crushing weight of the entity's despair. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the searing silver light, but it was imprinted on the inside of his eyelids, burning into his mind. He could feel his own thoughts, his own memories, becoming fragile, insignificant, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of Somnus Nullus's eternal vigil. Beside him, Evelyn was lost. Her gasps had turned into soft moans of terrifying ecstasy. She was on her knees, arms still outstretched, her face a mask of serene horror as she willingly surrendered her mind to the embrace of the sleepless god. He could feel her consciousness, her unique spark, being absorbed, becoming another thread in the vast, sorrowful tapestry of Somnus Nullus. She joins the chorus of the ever-waking. The thought, cold and triumphant, echoed not in Mac's ears but resonated deep within his fracturing mind, a direct transmission from the entity. Her knowledge, her curiosity, now mine. The loss of Evelyn, even in her descent, struck Mac with a profound pang of despair, which only seemed to feed the entity, to draw him further in. He had to fight, not with his fists, not with the maglite that was now useless against this immaterial onslaught, but with the core of his own being. He focused on a single point of resistance, a memory, anything to anchor himself. His crew, their faces, their camaraderie before Northgate had poisoned everything. Sal's bluff humor, Javi's quiet strength, Davy's youthful optimism, Sam's eager intellect. He clung to these images, these remnants of a reality that Somnus Nullus was trying to erase. Insignificant, fleeting, mortal concerns. The entity's thoughts brushed against his mental shields like a wave of icy indifference. Your brief lives, a flicker in my endless day. No, Mac gasped, the word a ragged tear in the psychic storm. He forced his eyes open, confronting the blinding silver light of the locket. You don't get to take us all. You don't get to win. The silver light pulsed, intensified. The pressure on his mind became unbearable. He felt himself slipping, his identity fraying. He was drowning in an ocean of another's unending pain. Then another memory surfaced, unbidden. The small, tarnished silver locket he had found. The actual locket. Not this monstrous, spectral projection, but the physical object. He still had it in his pocket. He'd taken it from his locker before this last, fatal foray, a morbid talisman. With a monumental effort of will, Mac fumbled in his jacket pocket, his fingers clumsy, numb. He felt the cool, familiar shape of the small, heart-shaped locket. He pulled it out, holding it up, a tiny speck of reality against the overwhelming psychic illusion of its giant counterpart. The symbol remains, but its meaning is mine now. Somnus nullus's consciousness sneered, the silver light from the spectral locket flaring, attempting to consume the tiny object in Mac's hand. But something unexpected happened. As the psychic force of Somnus nullus focused on the small, physical locket, the torrent of memories flooding Mac's mind faltered for a fraction of a second. The immense pressure lessened almost imperceptibly. It was as if the entity's vast, scattered consciousness for a single instant had been distracted, or perhaps, more accurately, as if a part of its attention, its very essence, was being drawn, siphoned into the real-world object. The locket in Mac's hand grew warm, then hot, almost searingly so. A faint, silver light began to emanate from it, a pale reflection of the terrible glory of its spectral twin. Mac didn't understand what was happening, but he seized the momentary reprieve. He focused all his will, all his remaining sense of self, not on resisting somnus nullus, agony, but on the locket in his hand, on the memory of the sad-eyed woman in the miniature portrait it once held. Who was she? Somnus nullus's wife, sister, a lost love, the one human connection that had perhaps tethered him to sanity before the darkness consumed him. He poured his own desperate hope, his own refusal to surrender, into that image, into the physical object. The effect was startling. The spectral locket in the cell flickered. The intense silver light dimmed for a heartbeat, and a wave of confusion, pain, something other than cold, implacable malice emanated from Somnus nullus. The real locket in Mac's hand now glowed with an almost unbearable heat, the silver light radiating from it becoming brighter, purer. And in that light, Mac saw, not with his eyes but in his mind, a fleeting image. The sad-eyed woman, her face filled with sorrow, reaching out. Not to him, but towards the monstrous, spectral locket, towards the tormented consciousness trapped within. Forgive. The word was not from Somnus nullus. It was a whisper, faint, feminine, filled with an aching love and an impossible grief, seemingly emanating from the small locket he held. Let go. The spectral locket, the core of Somnus nullus's power, convulsed. The silver light fractured, turning a chaotic, angry red, then a sickly yellow, then back to a wavering, unstable silver. The chorus of suffering voices that formed the entity's consciousness screamed, a soundless, psychic shriek of agony and conflict. It was as if the small, physical locket, imbued with the lingering essence of a lost love, was acting as a conduit, a lightning rod, for some incredibly powerful, positive emotion, love, forgiveness, a plea for release, that was anathema to the centuries of cultivated despair that Somnus nullus had become. Mac felt the pressure on his own mind recede further. He could breathe again, think again, even as the psychic battle raged around him. He looked at Evelyn. She was still on her knees, but the ecstatic look was gone, replaced by confusion, pain. Her head was turning from side to side, as if caught between two opposing forces. Evelyn, Mac yelled, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed her arm, hauling her up. We have to go now while it's distracted. She stumbled, her eyes unfocused, but she didn't resist as he pulled her towards the passage. The circular chamber of the quiet cells was in chaos. The scratches on the walls pulsed erratically, the colors shifting wildly. The oily ichor dripped faster, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. The spectral locket at the heart of the cell was shrinking, its light dimming, flickering as if its power were being drained or grounded. The small locket in Mac's hand was now so hot he could barely hold it, but he didn't let go. It felt alive, a beacon. As they stumbled out of the quiet cells back into the main corridor of Ward C, a sound followed them, not a whisper, not a command, but a long, drawn-out sigh of immense, unutterable weariness, of a burden perhaps finally beginning to lift. The breathing of the wing faltered, became ragged, then seemed to stop altogether. The eye marks on the walls faded, their inner light extinguished, leaving only dull, meaningless smudges in the dust. The oppressive cold lessened, replaced by the natural damp chill of the sub-basement. Mac didn't stop, didn't look back. He dragged Evelyn, who was now weeping not in ecstasy, but in a dazed human sorrow, through the increasingly quiet, increasingly mundane corridors of Ward C. When they reached the entrance, Sal was there, his face a mask of terror, a heavy fire axe in his hands, clearly having overcome his fear enough to contemplate a rescue. "Boss, Dr. Reed, you're alive." "Let's get out of here, Sal," Mac gasped, his throat raw, his mind reeling. Seal it now." The confrontation hadn't been a victory, not in any traditional sense. He hadn't defeated Somnus Nullus, but perhaps, just perhaps, with the unexpected intervention of a love that had transcended even death and a century of torment, he had given it something else, a chance, however slim, for peace. Or perhaps, he thought with a final, chilling surge of doubt, he had only managed to awaken something even older, something even more deeply buried within the Locket's silver heart. He didn't know. All he knew was that the immediate, overwhelming presence of Somnus Nullus, the conscious, malevolent intellect that had been Ward C, was, for the moment, quiescent. The vigil perhaps had finally blinked. Chapter 16. No Escape. They stumbled out of Ward C into the marginally less oppressive gloom of the sub-basement access corridor, Max supporting the still weeping, disoriented Evelyn, Sal bringing up the rear, his face etched with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The air here felt different, thinner, the silence no longer pregnant with malevolent intent, but merely empty. The locket, Mac," Evelyn mumbled, her voice thick with tears, as Mac gently lowered her to sit on a stack of discarded pallets. She was pointing a shaking finger at his hand. Mac looked down. The small, silver locket was still clutched in his fist. It was no longer glowing, no longer hot. It was just a piece of old, tarnished metal. He opened his fingers. The portrait of the sad-eyed woman was gone, the recess empty, as if the image had burned away or served its purpose and departed. It stopped," Max said, bewildered. The intense connection he'd felt to it, the sense of it being a beacon, was gone. "What happened in there, boss?" Sal asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The whole wing. It just went quiet, like someone flipped a switch." Max shook his head, trying to clear the lingering psychic residue of Somnus Nullus. "I don't know, Sal, I think the locket did something. Interrupted it, gave it something else to focus on besides us." He didn't want to try and explain the fleeting images of forgiveness, the feminine whisper, the sense of an ancient love battling an even more ancient despair. It sounded insane, even to him, now that the immediate psychic pressure was off. Evelyn was slowly regaining some composure, the dazed, almost possessed look fading from her eyes, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness and a dawning horror at what she had experienced, what she had almost become. He's he's still there, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the newly sealed entrance to Ward C that Mac and Sal had hastily bricked up in a frenzy of desperate activity, using the same bricks they had removed weeks earlier. Their masonry was crude, hurried, but it felt like the most important construction job of their lives. But he's changed, quieter, almost, at rest. The sorrow is still there, the pain, but the rage, it's muted. Let's hope it stays that way, Max said grimly. He had no illusions that Somnus Nullus was gone. Weakened, perhaps. Distracted, certainly. But an entity that had endured for a century, fusing its consciousness with an entire wing of an asylum, wasn't going to be vanquished by a heartfelt memory. Their escape from Northgate was swift. Mac called Henderson, his voice flat and uncompromising, telling him the West Wing project was terminated due to unforeseen and extreme structural hazards and atmospheric contaminants that made the site unworkable and a severe health risk. He ignored Henderson's sputtering protests and threats, stating a full report, heavily redacted for safety reasons, would follow. He knew there would be legal battles, financial repercussions. He didn't care. Sal, despite his blistered arm, drove them away from the asylum, his foot heavy on the accelerator, not looking back. Evelyn sat in the back, huddled and silent, clutching her satchel of notes, her gaze fixed on the receding Gothic silhouette of Northgate against the bruised twilight sky. Mac rode shotgun, the small, now inert Locket heavy in his pocket. They thought they had escaped. They thought they had sealed the horror behind a wall of brick and mortar. They were wrong. The first indication came a week later. Mac was at home, trying to piece together a coherent and legally defensible report for Henderson, his mind still struggling with the fragmented memories of Somnus Nullus, agony, when he received a call from Sal. "Boss," Sal's voice was panicked, strained. "My arm, the rash, it's spreading and I'm having the dreams again, worse than before. The hounds, they're back, but they're different, more solid. And they're not just in the asylum corridors in my dreams anymore. They're outside in my street, watching my house." Mac felt a cold dread. The oily ichor from the wing. Sal had been directly exposed. He tried to reassure Sal, told him to see a specialist, but a sinking feeling was taking root. A few days after that, Evelyn called. Her voice was faint, hesitant. She had been trying to write, to document her experiences, her communion with Somnus Nullus, but she couldn't focus. "The whispers, Mac," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're starting again, not from the wing, from the Locket." Mac's blood ran cold. He'd kept the Locket, unsure what to do with it. It sat on his desk, a silent, tarnished reminder. "What is it saying, Evelyn?" It's him, Somnus Nullus, but weaker, confused. He's asking for her, the woman in the portrait, he says. He says the Locket is a door, but it's broken. He's trapped between worlds, between his rage and her peace, and he's lonely. The vigil had not found rest. It had been fractured, its consciousness perhaps partially drawn into the locket, but not anchored, not released. And the locket itself, the conduit for that momentary reprieve, was now a focal point for its disquiet. The true horror began to unfold over the next few weeks. Sal's condition worsened. The rash spread over his body, causing agonizing pain. Doctors were baffled. His nightmares became waking hallucinations. He spoke of shadowy hounds constantly at the periphery of his vision, of red eyes staring at him from dark corners. He became paranoid, aggressive. His wife called Mac, terrified, saying Sal was no longer himself. Evelyn, too, deteriorated. Her brief lucidity after escaping the wing vanished. Her connection to the locket and through it to the fractured consciousness of somnus nullus deepened. She filled notebooks not with academic observations, but with frantic, automatic writing, channels of the entity's disjointed thoughts, its confusion, its unending sorrow, its terrifying loneliness. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, her physical form wasting away as her mind became a prison for a fragment of the sleepless god. Mac felt it too, though more subtly. Headaches, a persistent, low-level anxiety, dreams filled with endless, shifting corridors and the faint, distant echo of Latin whispers, and the locket. Sometimes, when he was near it, he would feel a faint psychic pull, a cold tendril of awareness brushing against his mind. Somnus nullus was reaching out, seeking. What? Anchors, new vessels, release. He realized with dawning, sickening certainty that they hadn't escaped Northgate. They had carried a piece of it with them. The physical sealing of Ward C meant nothing when the entity itself had found new conduits. Sal, through the corrosive touch of the wing's blood. Evelyn, through her willing psychic communion. And Mac himself, through the locket, the very object that had seemed to offer salvation. There was no escape from somnus nullus. It was a contagion of consciousness, and they were its new hosts, its new prison, or perhaps its new tendrils reaching out into the unsuspecting world. The horror of Ward C was not confined by bricks and mortar. It was insidious, invasive, and it had followed them home. The vigil remained, and now it was learning to walk in their world. Chapter 17, Eternal Vigil. The weeks that followed were a descent into a private, inescapable hell for Mac. Sal's deterioration was rapid and horrifying. The strange, corrosive rash that had started on his arm consumed his skin, leaving him in constant, agonizing pain. His mind, tormented by waking nightmares of the insomnia hounds, fractured completely. He became violent, paranoid, a danger to himself and his distraught family. Medical science offered no answers, no solace. He was eventually institutionalized, diagnosed with a rare, unidentifiable systemic infection coupled with acute psychosis. Mac visited him once. The man he saw strapped to a hospital bed, eyes wide with unseeing terror, muttering about shadow dogs and the burning eyes, was not Sal. It was a hollow shell, consumed from within by the lingering touch of Ward C. Evelyn Reed became a recluse. Her academic brilliance, her fierce intellect, all surrendered to the fractured consciousness of somnus nullus that whispered to her through the tarnished silver locket. Mac had tried to take the locket from her, believing it to be the source of her decline, but she had reacted with a feral, desperate strength he wouldn't have thought possible, clutching it to her chest, her eyes blazing with a cold, alien light. She spoke of Somnus Nullus not as a monster, but as a shattered deity, a being of immense sorrow and power whose song of waking she was now privileged to transcribe. Her apartment, when Mac forced his way in after days of unanswered calls, was a horrifying testament to her madness. Every surface was covered in her spidery, automatic writing, chaotic symbols, and obsessive drawings of eyes and the locket. She was emaciated, her gaze fixed on some inner, terrifying vista. Like Sal, she too was eventually institutionalized. Her diagnosis, a litany of psychiatric terms that failed to capture the true, supernatural horror of her condition. Mac was alone. Sal and Evelyn were gone, consumed. Javi had vanished, wanting no further contact with anything related to Northgate. Sam Kwon was a broken man, living in fear, his brilliant mind scarred. And Mac had the locket, or perhaps the locket had him. He tried to get rid of it. He threw it in a river, only to find it back on his nightstand the next morning, cold and inexplicably dry. He buried it in his backyard, deep beneath the earth, but the following day it lay on his kitchen counter, seemingly mocking him. He even tried to melt it with a blowtorch, but the silver, though it glowed cherry red, refused to lose its shape, and the psychic backlash, a wave of pure, concentrated agony and rage that flooded his mind, left him writhing on his workshop floor for an hour. The locket was a part of him now, a conduit to the fractured, lonely, and still immensely powerful consciousness of Somnus Nullus. The whispers were almost constant, a subliminal soundtrack to his waking hours, pleas, fragments of memory, bursts of incoherent rage, and always the profound, aching loneliness. His dreams were no longer his own. They were extensions of Somnus Nullus's eternal, sleepless vigil, labyrinthine corridors of shadow and sorrow, populated by the ghosts of Northgate and the tormented echoes of the sleepless one's unending despair. He understood now the true nature of the horror. Somnus Nullus wasn't just tied to the stones of Ward C. Its consciousness, so vast and so traumatized, had become a field, an energy that could imprint itself, attach itself, to anything that resonated with its suffering, or anything that offered a glimmer of release. The locket, once a symbol of lost love and a momentary key to its quiescence, had become its most potent anchor in the world beyond Northgate's walls. And through the locket, Somnus Nullus continued its vigil. Mac found he couldn't stay in one place for long. The presence of the locket, the constant psychic hum of the entity, began to affect his surroundings. Cold spots would develop in his apartment. Objects would move inexplicably. Sometimes in the periphery of his vision he would see them, the faint, shimmering outlines of the eye marks, trying to form on his walls, a sign that the entity was attempting to establish a new nexus, a new Ward C through him. He became a wanderer, moving from city to city, cheap motel to cheap motel, always carrying the locket, his cursed companion. He knew that if he stayed too long in one place, the influence would grow, take root, perhaps even manifest physically as it had in the asylum. He was a carrier of a psychic plague, a walking, unwilling prison for a god of despair. He tried to fight it to maintain his sanity, his identity. He would talk back to the whispers, sometimes screaming into the silence of his empty rooms, refusing to surrender. But it was a losing battle. The sheer weight of Somnus Nullus's eternal suffering, its vast loneliness, was an insidious, grinding pressure that was slowly eroding his will, his sense of self. Sometimes, in moments of terrible clarity, he would see himself as merely another phase in the entity's existence. Somnus Nullus had been confined to a body, then to a cell, then to a wing of an asylum. Now, through the locket, through Mac, it was free in a way. Free to wander the world, a fragmented, sorrowful, and potentially malevolent consciousness, forever seeking something, understanding, company, or simply new minds to infect with its waking nightmare. He never found an answer. His life became an eternal vigil, a mirror of Somnus Nullus's own. He was sleepless, haunted, wandering in a world that could not see the monstrous sorrow he carried, the terrifying God that whispered in his mind. The last anyone heard of Marcus, Mac Cole, was a brief, garbled entry in a police blotter from a small, forgotten town in the Midwest. A motel owner had reported a guest who had simply vanished, leaving behind a room that was unnaturally cold, the walls covered in strange, eye-like smudges, and a single, tarnished silver locket lying on the bedside table. The locket was taken as evidence. Then, finding no connection to any known crime, eventually relegated to a dusty box in an evidence locker. There it sits, cold and silent, waiting. For the locket is a door, and Somnus Nullus, the sleepless one in its fractured, tormented state, is always seeking a new threshold, a new mind to share its endless, waking vigil. The horror of Ward C was never truly sealed. It merely waits for the door to be opened again. Vigil permanebit, the vigil remains. Always. The end.